forget, don't cheat on taxes because you will get caught. Especially if you cheat wrong.
Oh my God.
Welcome to Nacht Waffen.
Welcome to Nacht Waffen Pilot with Penny Bradley. Today's guest is Douglas Dietrich. And before we get started, I want to remind folks that next weekend I'm going to be in Las Vegas for the 5D Events Conference, where I will be there from the 4th through the 7th, plus travel time. So if you're on my Facebook, don't expect me to be online. There's quite a collection of us going to be there. Me, Tony Rodriguez, Eric Hecker, Misha Johnston, Joseph Powell, James Rink, and Anthony Zender. And we are the Super Soldier SSP group that will be part of this consciousness conference. So we are not even the main part of the conference, but if you want to meet us, we'll be there. So, because this is Samhain weekend, Douglas and I talked about what was the scariest thing that we knew of in our world. I mean, we're talking 3D, real, physical Earth. And we agreed that that was Colonel Aquino. And so that will be the main point of our discussion today. And my understanding is that we have just under 4 hours to fill. So get your coffee cup filled, relax, enjoy the day. Welcome, Douglas.
Thank you, honey. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Well, you look lovely, very stunning in your attire, very perfect for the season.
This is my Renaissance dress, and it's made out of pan velvet, and the solar cross goes with my family, and the tiara is just for silly.
Right, but it's great, and it definitely is, shall we say, gets us all in the mood. And in terms of what mood there can be had with this sort of thing, I'm very pleased to be here, of course. And as is ever the case, as is the case with yourself, it takes a while for either of us to wake up and or whatever.
Yeah, Lou got me up 3 hours ago, and I'm still dragging.
The same here, honey. It's just I got home about a few hours ago, and so I'm not here physically. I'm just, we're going to try and tether me down enough where I can say something coherent. But I do want to qualify certain types of fear or alarm or clear and present dangers or threats. Certainly, one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that tomorrow night I'll come back again from celebrations and possibly stay up through the night. I'm not quite sure. When it comes to tomorrow night, I'll be on my own regular channel, and that'll be the YouTube channel where people can basically rendezvous with me for that transmission as well. And when it comes to that particular channel, you have to, of course, like with all YouTube channels, spell it right, but at least mine is a little easier to spell. It's youtube.com/the lowercase c. All the other letters in that YouTube address can be uppercase, but that C in the middle has got to be lowercase. So it's youtube.com/lowercase c and then slash Douglas Dietrich, youtube.com/c/Douglas Dietrich. And Dietrich is spelled like diet rich. Put the words diet and rich together. For the older people among us who remember Marlene Dietrich, it's spelled exactly the same way. Douglas is spelled with one S, so it's the Douglas Dietrich channel. And I do recommend everyone join us at every Sunday and Wednesday night, usually. There's very seldom a break in that. But tonight, we'll see how long tomorrow night, we'll see how long I last after doing the back-to-back interviews throughout the weekend and partying nonstop in between those. So when it comes to the topic of discussion tomorrow night, I will be discussing Far East Asian geopolitics, the military situation in East Asia. And one thing I would say is at this moment in time, at this point in history, it's hard for me to imagine anything scarier than that. However, Michael Aquino, the reason it's for Halloween, people might say, what has that got to do with Halloween? But well, we're I was gonna say, with all the talk that we're doing throughout the weekend on child trafficking rings,
Yes.
certainly have mercy, give me a break. And I'll need a break from that to a different kind of alarm and clear and present danger. And the developing situation in the Far East is something that is profoundly threatening to all of us. So in the interim, though, we will talk about how we got to this point in terms of Michael Aquino, because he was a big part of how we got to this point about why we're so fucked up. He certainly personified it. And he was an individual. I think what's so profoundly frightening about Michael Aquino is how he got away with what he did, that he died a free man, and that he basically was someone who lived a life of impunity. But in the end, he did die comparatively young. And we're talking about somebody who died in his mid-70s, early 70s, perhaps mid-70s. And he was like just maybe about 10 or more years, 10, 12 years into retirement, essentially, quote unquote, though such individuals never truly retire. And he was someone who had a much more profound impact on the world than people realize. So we'll go into that perhaps immediately. I could start with that. Unless, dear Penny, you have some other angle to start with first. Is there some particular, perhaps I should start with how he was born, a poor black sharecropper's son or something, or would you would you prefer that?
When I was thinking of how to approach this, I was thinking more Ordo Templo Orientalis to Temple of Set. But my understanding is that the population at large does not really understand the subtleties between these different groups and just dumps them all under the category of Satanist. So probably going into the subtleties of what makes each of these groups different from each other is beyond the pale for this show.
That would be what I would gather. Yes, I would feel that would be almost an exercise in futility. And
I already get people deciding that I am a demon and that I'm teaching things. I've this being the week that it is, I've come up against a lot of people who are in their rallied Christianity mode.
Right. Right. Well, they fail to understand that Halloween is actually the most Christian of all holidays, really. And if they don't get that, of course, they're hopeless. There is much about Halloween that is rooted in Christianity.
The whole idea of Samhain being that the veil is thin and that it was started by a soul that this. His name was Jack, and he had somehow beaten the devil so he could not go into hell, but he was never good enough to make it into heaven. And so he ended up walking the earth because neither one would take him. So that's basically a Christian doctrinal statement and warning
There we are. Yes, and so you're very familiar with all of this, as of course you would be. So in terms of all of this, we might as well get started into the Aquino subject. So in terms of trying to start off with how he was born and all the rest of that stuff, let's just talk about the impact that he had that most people don't realize to start off with. And the fact is that, or how I got to work there, what exactly happened. That would be another.
How did you meet him?
Yeah. Well, there we are.
I
So,
haven't heard that
okay.
part of the story.
Okay. Yeah. So, in terms of that part of the story, let's get there. First, let's say the impact that he had. Michael Aquino was profoundly responsible in terms of his participation for two things. It's important to remember this because we can get back to this in arc of narrative. We don't need to go in depth right now. But both Michael Aquino and myself served in the Gulf War. It was like the only time I was in service, and I was in service with the United States Marine Corps. The incredible thing about it is that the attack on myself, because of what I've exposed about the military, which ultimately shut down the Presidio military base, which was an Army base. One of the reasons I entered the Marine Corps was because I had to avoid anything to do with the Army. And when I entered the Marine Corps, it's a rival service. And because of its history, which I expose in the Roswell Deception, which is a nonfiction book that covers the history of World War II and how the United States lost World War II. All of that is very relevant to what we're talking about when we talk about Aquino, because he was one of the men who masterminded the Roswell Deception. In other words, he helped to provide a cover story for Roswell when the story began to break to the American public, when Sergeant Melvin Brown, who was on site at Roswell during the atrocity, began to speak to his relations about the reality of the Japanese that were killed on site. And because of that, the Americans faced a scandal, or rather the American Army in particular, of which the Air Force was still a part of at the time. The Air Force was not yet a separate branch of service. And so they responded ultimately by sending Michael Aquino. They recalled him from Vietnam to do what he did best, which was psychological operations, but he applied them against the American public, and therefore was the man who established the Roswell myth, that it was extraterrestrial. And when it came to the aftermath of that, he had once again proved himself to the Army and was given greater degrees of impunity, freedom of operations. And he took full advantage of that because of the incredible incompetence, the negligence, the sheer stupidity and corruption of everyone around him. So when I became a whistleblower and exposed the more grisly ramifications of his freedom of action and so many other people who were affiliated with him, he was one among many, then I could never go back into doing anything with the Army, even though I had been affiliated with them only as a civilian through the Department of Defense, working as a military librarian. It was not something that, how would I say it? I knew enough about them and they knew enough about me, where that was not the branch of service I was going to have any capability of insinuating myself into. So because of the hostile history, and it is very hostile, between the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps, I went into the Marine Corps for what I intended to be a single hitch in order to gain enough experience to do private contracting, which would be mercenary work or security work, which I ultimately segued into. But during that period of time in the Gulf War, I was exposed to cycloserine nerve gas, which of course resulted in ultimately multiple lung collapses over the next several years, spontaneous pneumothoraces. Of course, with my experience, I could work private contracts because most people never asked about injuries. Basically, if you're able to show up for work and it looks like you're functional, nobody's probing into your medical history. However, collapsed lungs would theoretically prevent someone from entering military service because of the potential for them to collapse again. In my case, of course, it is distinct evidence that I served in the Gulf War. The interesting thing, of course, and it's rather karmic, when I worked with the Department of Defense, what I specialized in was documents destruction, and of course, under orders which would be considered illegal orders. There is such a category. Nevertheless, illegal orders are impossible to disobey, considering the situation most people are in which the only alternative is losing one's employment, which for the longest period of time while I was with the Department of Defense, I was intending that as my career. And I had ultimately hoped to segue into think tanks and presentation of various scenarios for research and development, which is actually a company. Its acronym is RAND, R-A-N-D, and the acronym stands for Research and Development. And they're affiliated with MIT. So I never made that transfer. I instead became a public informant simply because the atrocities ongoing at the Presidio military base were that dire. So when I entered the Marine Corps for a period of time to ultimately segue into private contracts with security work, mercenary work, in order to make enough money to retire, which I ultimately did, even though I spent it all on care for my parents whose health situation deteriorated so dramatically. The fact remains that when I was in the Persian Gulf, I was exposed to cyclosaurine nerve gas, as were many, many Marines. Many of them, the majority of them, died. With the U.S. Army, it was exposure to depleted uranium was the majority cause for most of them degenerating. With the Marines, it was the exposure to the cyclosaurine nerve gas. If I had not been dishonorably discharged, and had access and full benefits to the Veterans Administration, I would be dead by now because their care is subpar and it really doesn't qualify as care at all. Whereas because I was dishonorably discharged and had to access civilian care, it's thanks to UCSF, though I have my own arguments against them and my own bones of contention with them that are quite serious. The fact remains that I owe them my life. It was thanks to UCSF that by the time of the seventh lung collapse, and to put this into some perspective, both of my lungs began collapsing. And when they collapsed, it was not always simultaneous, but a few times it was due to mitigating circumstances. The first time that my lungs collapsed, that mitigating circumstance was a medical intern or resident, the student, basically, the one on the floor, as opposed to the I believe the doctors are called attending and the students are called the resident. I can't remember exactly, but I believe that's the case.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the way it operates, yes.
Thank you. And so he jammed the chest tube into my chest with such force, as if he were harpooning a whale, that he collapsed the other lung. That was the first time I suffered two lung collapses at once. So he literally killed me. I was clinically dead. But that's not the first time. That I was clinically dead. We brought that up before briefly, but my point being that with these kinds of scars and the fact that ultimately UCSF, after several years, finally, when I demanded something be done and threatened a lawsuit, they acquiesced and they conducted radical experimental surgery and unhinged my lower jawbone and went inside via my wide open mouth at that point, that great gaping aperture, to staple my lungs to my rib cage. So that's all the evidence, and the staples are visible through X-rays, as are the chest tube sites are visible to anyone who looks at it. So I obviously have severe injuries from the Gulf War, but the Marine Corps, of course, has fabricated its documents. It's just simply altered the documents to say I wasn't there. And but what's ironic is I'm one of the few people who has the irrefutable scars where it's proven that I was there, because unlike, say, for instance, some kind of shrapnel wound or stab wound or gunshot wound, any one of those could be self-inflicted by someone psychotically determined enough to say they were injured. But something like a lung collapse, That's impossible to self-administer. You cannot self-administer lung collapses. So that is definitely a result of the cycloserine nerve gas. But my point is, while I was in the Gulf War, so was Michael Aquino. And while that was my only service to the Congressional Republic, with Michael Aquino, it was his last bout of service. That was the last service he ever conducted on the field of battle as a military officer in full uniform for the Constitutional Republic. And that was when he committed himself to essentially some very intensive summoning rituals. And this had much to do with the devastation of the Iraqi army in terms of morale. We have to remember that, as I've said before, when I was working at the Presidio military base, which was fresh out of high school, that'll bring us to how I met Michael Aquino. When I was going to quote unquote high school, technically it wasn't a high school. Technically it was a vocational institute. And that is a difference so that people understand. A high school is a place that you go to usually with every intention of going on to higher education. So in other words, most people are going through high school have no concept that they are getting a job after high school. Most people go to high school so that they can go to college. But John O'Connell Vocational Institute in San Francisco, any vocational institute, if you go on to higher education after a vocational institute, a time after time in a vocational institute, that means they've completely failed. The job of a vocational institute, the job of a vocational institute is to get you a job. The idea is that you will be working after you graduate. That's the whole, you're learning a trade. That's the whole point. But John O'Connell Vocational Institute was infamous for nobody learning anything. And so it was nobody went on.
So it was like a waste of time.
Yes, it was a complete and total waste of time. But most of education was a complete and total waste of time up to the point of higher education. Once I got to higher education, then there was some constructive learning. But you might say, well, you know, the lower educational grade levels were preparing me through reading, writing, math, and arithmetic. No. No. Everything was learned outside of that environment. That there was nothing that was learned in public school at all. I mean, anything.
I actually learned quite a bit in public school, but it wasn't what they wanted me to learn.
I like that. Yes, there you go. I mean, that's the way it is with most people. You're not alone. And but John O'Connell and the story of John O'Connell fits in with the Michael Aquino story. It's all, as a matter of fact, rather seamlessly bound. So when it comes to the entire situation that I was talking about with the Gulf War, and that being Aquino's last service, so to speak, understand this much. During the time that I was going to John O'Connell Vocational Institute, the trade that I was learning for the majority of time that I was there, till I graduated early because I took the GED to get out of there as soon as possible. What I was learning as a trade was commercial illustration. And as a matter of fact, I was applying my commercial illustration trade immediately while I was there. So in a sense, John O'Connell Vocational Institute was a success for me, a true success story, because I was already learning a trade that I was applying to make money. Of course, ultimately, this involved pornography. And one of the things that people need to remember about San Francisco, certainly today, one of the things that people may not know about San Francisco, because it's changed so radically and everything has changed, is that San Francisco at that time, in the days before the internet, was just this side of Paris, probably more so than Paris, the pornography capital of the world. The overwhelming majority of pornography was filmed, you might think, in Los Angeles. Much of it was also filmed here, and many of the pornographic actors and actresses would retire in San Francisco, and we had an entire burlesque industry, which I grew up in. I grew up in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, where the majority of the adult entertainment centers were in full operation. So aside from that, what we had was an underground comics industry. And the underground comics industry was infamous, just famous. You had Robert Crumb, you had various other basically drug artists who were producing comics with their own private printing presses. And so these people became world famous. These were people whose comics they're psychedelic comics, basically, were being read all over the world. And so I could enter the profession immediately. Even before I was of legal age to purchase pornography, I was illustrating it because we still had a lot of pornographic comics output.
I am not even going to ask how you knew what you were drawing.
Well, as I said, I grew up in the environment of adult entertainment. It was and of course, because of the background of the kind of just how would I say it? Not surprisingly, just to put this into perspective, because we're going to speak about trauma against children. I was traumatized when I was younger because my grandfather, basically, when on my father's side, my father's father, the man who raised and guided me, George Dietrich, was a sailor who brought us from Taiwan. He had married my mother in Taiwan, and my sister and I were both born there. When we were brought to the United States, he wanted to resettle in upstate New York. And in upstate New York, we moved in with his father to take care of his father. But his father was completely psychotic and deranged and a vicious child rapist. So this was basically something I found out and confirmed, found it out the hard way, but I confirmed it with the rest of the family, who shared with me that when my father grew up, he ran away from home to escape that. But aside from him, there was a number of other sons that this individual, of course, and this is not to defend him, but simply to contextualize his madness. My grandfather on my father's side worked for Eastman Kodak Company. George Eastman, of course, established Kodak Company, which was a very large part of World War II. And understand that this is something, of course, that people have a hard time looking up on records, because this is, again, the detractors. This is the United States Marine Corps and its character assassination campaign against myself. And it's funded by a man named Stephen Outram, who was very much affiliated with Michael Aquino. And of course, all the rumors said that he became a multimillionaire because of Michael Aquino. He was born in New Zealand. He ultimately relocated to Australia. He used to run what was called Sausage Software. Now, Sausage Software is 1 million years old, but it was one of the first software companies. And this was when Silicon Valley was just becoming Silicon Valley. And so he was in on the ground floor, and he got a contract with the Department of Defense. And what happened was that Michael Aquino, as what everyone said at the Presidio military base, was that Michael Aquino gave him the time to sell just before the Silicon Valley snake oil bubble boom burst. And when he sold short and sold Sausage Software, he made well over $70 million. And then he, quote unquote, retired. I mean, well, basically, he did retire. He's unlike all other software men or moguls who can't stop doing what they're doing because it's all they know in life. They eat, live, and breathe their software. He just stopped because he wasn't really into software. He was just somebody who was tinkering with something at the very beginning of its launch, so to speak. He was on the launch pad, but he really wasn't one of these technical geniuses. So all he did was sell short at the right time. And when he sold short, he became a multimillionaire. It's like winning the lottery, except Aquino gives you the ticket.
A lot of times timing is everything.
Oh yeah, well, when it's perfectly timed with inside dope, yeah, then it's even better. So the reason that all of that is important is because people can certainly, and I welcome them to do this. You can see his character assassination of myself just by looking up Douglas Dietrich, Burners and the Mad, and it's just what we call a colon column. He goes on for thousands and thousands of pages. This is a multimillionaire, mind you. And his whole life is simply attacking Douglas Dietrich. This is all he has in life. But one of the things that he does is he puts in photographic evidence of himself speaking with Michael Aquino. So he is a Aquino cultist, and that much is known. He hates myself, of course, because I never had sex with him. He had proposed to pay me for that, but I said no very respectfully. But of course, he couldn't handle that, and so that's his life now, and how he feels that he can carry out his services to Michael Aquino in return for Michael Aquino helping him become a millionaire. Now, in terms of that other aspect of Aquino's influence, it brings us back to the concept of course, child abuse, and it brings us back to the reality of what happened to myself in upstate New York, and why people have a hard time dating this. Understand that George Eastman, who developed the Kodak company, he was somebody who was brilliant, and he was also somebody who had aspirations that were a little above standard convention, in the sense that he felt he could truly change the world. So when I was working as a Department of Defense research librarian, one of the things that I constantly ran into with documents that were from private industry contractors to the military, and understand that the military makes absolutely nothing. There are no Army or Navy factories. Everything is contracted to civilian companies. Civilian companies make everything that the military uses, and that includes, of course, even for space. No matter what, I had to get that in there for the sake of Penny. And she knows that. But everything that, yeah.
I wore uniforms that were built by Aegis.
There we are. Thank you. And so in terms of the that fact, I would run across something very specific when it came to Kodak company documents. And it turns out that George Eastman developed his own calendar. And he felt that this would be the perfect universal business calendar. And he approached the League of Nations. This is something anybody can look up and reference and research themselves. And he approached the League of Nations to put this calendar into effect worldwide for global business. And that way, all of business would be on the same calendrical system, that it wouldn't be Muslim lunar calendar or Chinese lunisolar calendar, or all cultural calendars in the case of business activities would be subjected or make way for the business calendar in terms of the realm of trade. Now, this isn't a sound idea, and but the League of Nations,
Yeah,
of course,
I know of at least 8 calendars that are out there in use and are incompatible with one another.
That's right. That's right. And so in terms of the Kodak company calendar, it was never taken up by the League of Nations, and this was considered a failure in his life, a personal failure in the life of George Eastman, who, for those of you who don't know, was so impacted by all the chemicals he worked with while developing photographic technology that he was in constant agony. And so ultimately he couldn't take the physical agony anymore, and he blew his brains out. He killed himself. And so my grandfather was in a similar case, where he had been so poisoned with all of the chemicals that he worked with at Eastman Kodak that he was just toxic. He was just simply toxic. And so when it came to his abuse, you could say it was sourced there, but I would argue, no, you have to understand that that would be defending him and providing a rationalization. He was just purely evil. And in the case of George Eastman, one of the things I noticed as a Department of Defense research librarian when dealing with the Kodak company documents was that they would be on their own calendrical system. In other words, they would say, when it came to the various bomb sites, optical lenses for sniper scopes, whatever there was being produced that was contracted to the U.S. military, the product blueprints would say this product was built on Kodak company time. And it had to say that because they were running by a totally different calendar. And so you had to basically find out what time they were on compared to what time you were on in terms if you wanted to date something. Well, so when you had that whole calendrical system, the interesting thing is that that kept going for quite some time, even after his death. And so when you had what happened to myself, one of the things that my detractors argue is that it's different from the calendar system of the United States. That's because it was recorded on Kodak Company time. Even though George Eastman was dead, Kodak Company was still very much alive when I was assaulted by my grandfather. So understand that, again, this is an attack by the enemy, and it's something that I have to contextualize. And it goes back to Aquino because he almost certainly was monitoring me starting at least that point. But at that time that we were in upstate New York, then my mother, her first indication that something was terribly wrong was when my father brought the family over, and that father of his met us all. And my father's mother was already dead. So in other words, the grandmother on my father's side was passed and not there to intervene. So it's just the old man living with us. And he considered everything in the house to be his property. When he first met us at the airport, my mother's recollection was that the first thing he did when she hugged him was he stuck his tongue in her mouth. And that was her first memory of him. And then when we got to his home, there would be incidents like whenever my parents went out to shop, and they would bring home entire loaves of bread and entire buckets of ice cream because there were two children and they were buying in bulk, like Costco size. He would devour it all until he vomited because he said, "It's in my house, it's all mine." So he would eat all the ice cream and all the loaves of bread. He would just gorge and eat them all and say, "This is all mine because it's in my house." And he felt that same way about us, that we were his to have sex with. Now, this is where the culture comes in. My mother, of course, was Japanese, and the idea of Japanese culture is that when it comes to the protecting the family, you have to do it in terms of gradation. You have to decide who is important for what reason. And when it comes to the child abuse, she protected me and threw my sister out as the sacrifice. And this was because if you ever watch Japanese plays or kabuki or their historical dramas, you'll see where the castle falls and the enemy is entering the castle, and the first thing that the enemy does is they have to kill every male heir. They kill every male heir so that there's no member left of the enemy who can succeed to the dynastic position of responsibility of the former daimyo or feudal warlord. And so what the samurai families will do is they'll throw their own children out and say, "This is the heir to the dynasty." And so the enemy will kill their own children. That way they save their lord's children. Their lord's children can escape while they throw their own children out to act as the cover, as a sacrifice. That's a samurai's duty, is not just to sacrifice himself, but to sacrifice the family. So in my mother's case, my sister was older by 3 years, and she threw my sister out to my grandfather to take the abuse so that I would be protected. But by the time I was, it wasn't long before he turned towards myself anyway. But that's when I killed him. I was 3 years old, and my teeth were just coming in, and I had seen him rape my sister repeatedly. But when he turned towards me and decided he was going to orally rape myself, I bit his penis off. Of course, it always wonders me why women never do this to their assailant. And it's bizarre to me that they don't do this. To me, it was reflexive. And when I bit his penis off, the first conscious memory I have, this is the first conscious memory in life, was that blood's got to taste better than this. His blood tasted like copper because of all of those toxins from all of those chemicals that he had been working with for years with Kodak. Anyhow, he died within about 48 to 72 hours, at which point the police told my family we'd better leave because, of course, the rest of the community would feel that we were murderers. And I remember the police, the first other conscious memory I have is the police referring to me as a monster. I remember that much. Your son is a monster. I remember them saying that. And so those are two of my first conscious memories in life. So in that sense, like many children who are abused, I was hypersexualized from witnessing what had happened to my sister to that point, which I don't really consciously remember, but know of, and in a sense do remember. But the real sharp memory was, of course, the taste of that blood and all that spurted out because he was erect. Of course, all the blood was there in the head between his legs. So the blood just kept spurting. So when it comes to that horror, that's the first experience that I had in life. And so this was why when we moved to the Tenderloin area of San Francisco, which was all my father could afford, and grew up in this ghetto where all of the burlesque centers were, I adapted much easier to the environment. And of course, the only woman there in general, except for the old biddies who couldn't afford to live anywhere else and were crashing and burning and dying in the Tenderloin cheap motels, which was their version of their final days, their hospice, so to speak. Everyone else was a prostitute in general. This was well before it became a family environment with all of the Southeast Asian immigrants moving in after the Vietnam War. So at that point, probably Aquino heard of me because of the military contracts with Kodak, and I'm almost certain he heard of it. As a matter of fact, he almost alluded to it several times. He never quite spoke of it, but he certainly alluded to it, that he knew of that incident. And so how I got to meet Aquino, quote unquote, first off, was my father was a military veteran who had served in over 3 wars. And as a retiree, he was allowed full access to the Presidio military base. And for those of you who don't know, if you serve all your life in the military, then you're allowed full access to open military bases where they have the post exchange and the commissary and other amenities that you can use that are cheaper than the civilian world. And this is usually only what military retirees can afford. So he would shop at the commissary, and he would take me with him to help him carry things. I acted as like a bag boy for my dad on his shopping trips several times. And by that, I mean, as a lifestyle, this is what we did. We went shopping to Presidio. It was just one of the facts of life. This was like, without that, we couldn't live. He kept emphasizing it was the Presidio military base kept us alive, that kind of bullshit, which is, it's true enough, but who wants that? It's, honestly, you're better off dead. And so when it came to the...
Are you really better off dead?
Jesus Christ. I mean, it's a subpar life. It's even though the Presidio military base was it's the most national park-like of all military bases, which is why it became a national park. It's still a piece of shit. I mean, you're surrounded by just everything in the military is shit. You're surrounded by people who are pieces of shit. These are all like, we don't forget what had happened at that time. We're talking about the end of the Vietnam War. This was
Daryl's responding.
Yeah.
So
we're talking about.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're talking about the end of the Vietnam War when the military went in revolt, and they broke into the officers. They broke into the officers' homes in the Presidio military base and were raping the officers' wives. So there were several cases where the officers' wives were being gang raped while we're like walking by their home. And, that my dad is trying to figure out a way to contact the military police on base. Don't forget, there was no cell phones in those days. The world was...
I don't forget, but I'm generally letting you talk about it because I know most of our audience is not old enough to remember those days.
Oh, God, yeah. And you have no idea the problems that I have trying to tell people about the reality of the world and the kind of challenges that I have.
I don't even try to tell them about it anymore because what I grew up with was we were on a party line and my grandmother had a phone and we didn't. And my grandmother's phone was a crank phone. So I'm... 10 years older than you are, and yet my generation experience is very different from yours.
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you.
So it's like going from the 1950s into today and trying to explain to kids who have never known anything other than cell phones and CDs what it was like then, and they have no point of reference for it.
Yeah, well, to try and give them some reference, understand this, that I was born in the 1960s, to everyone who's listening, 1966 specifically. And in the modern world, we're actually in the postmodern world. We take all too many items for granted that simply were not available then. And in terms of, try and imagine this, photocopiers, Scotch tape, personal computers, erasable ink, cell phones, satellite imaging, videotape, cassette tapes, CDs, computer graphics, big screen televisions, digital watches, and except unless you were, Penny Bradley or had access to NASA at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, there was no fucking Velcro. That truly was a space age material that was reserved for astronauts so they wouldn't float out in zero gravity. They put it on their ass so they'd stick to the seats. Yeah, and no microwave oven.
And to the boots. Okay, to put this in perspective even more, because I am older than you, my grandmother's house had an outhouse rather than an indoor bathroom. Mm. We had to carry buckets of water from the cistern and heat them on the stove before we could take a bath. And fortunately, she had a pipe from the bathtub to the outdoors.
That was luxury, yes.
Yes, it was. I have lived with a wood stove instead of a heater, and that was in use even, what was it, 15 years ago I had one.
Understood.
I'm talking about the culture has changed that much in my lifetime, and you start talking about young people my kids' age. My eldest is 45. Mm-hmm. And trying to explain to them what it was like when I was growing up, and I'm just one generation away from them.
Yes.
And the people that are listening to our show, some of them are 2 generations behind me. Yeah. So trying to make that distinction, they have really no personal point of reference for some of the stuff we talk about.
Thank you. And I think we've made our point, but honestly, just to drive this home, because I don't think people really grasp it, when it came to global positioning satellite systems, or more than 4 or 5 channels on television, for instance, none of that existed. In Penny's time, television was just like, how would you say it? You put a plastic screen over the black and white screen, and the plastic screen would have 3 colors on it, like green, blue, and red, or something weird like that. Green, red, and blue. So we'd add a sense of color.
We did not have TV until I was 7.
Yeah, I hear you. By the way, there were exceptions, and they were very bizarre. Because my father grew up in a Kodak company town, and Kodak was an experimental prototype advanced technology production facility for its time, he knew a single couple when he was very young. He knew a single couple who had what had to be one of the world's first televisions. Not that it was worth a shit, but it was like a big wooden box that had a single very thick cable, having nothing to do with cable television as we understand it, but a big thick cable that somehow connected it directly to probably some broadcasting center where they could see something only certain hours of a day, or maybe only certain days a week. There would be something that might be on it that would just be the little black and white fuzzy images, so that was funny to him. That was like space age, of course. But none of the electrical appliances there were no items that had the name Instant before them. There were no realistic cinematic special effects. Live television reporting of major events anywhere in the world was something that happened only by accident. And of course, there was no inexpensive Asian-made cars or flavored potato chips or vacuum-preserved dinners or even aluminum cans. But for the military, understand this, the military, all uniforms, all the fatigues were simply single solid color. There were no patterns. That was only certain elite units would have camouflage. So that was when I'm talking about the U.S. military and these soldiers revolting and raping the officers' wives. We're talking about men in olive drab. These are all men in olive drab. That's none of the kind of image you have of soldiers today. And they were all on drugs. You know, some of them were
Well,
so.
you know, the guys that got sent to were pumped full of drugs because they were trying to figure out what cocktail would make them more fierce warriors.
Well, it was either that they were simply, if they were doing it voluntarily, they were just blotting out their environment. They were desensitizing themselves. But all of this brings us back to Aquino. When my father would take me on these shopping trips, I would see Aquino because he stood out like a sore thumb. You're talking about the man who I said,
Yeah.
oh, look, he looks like Dracula. That's what I said. And so
The first time I saw a photograph and those eyebrows, it was, oh my God, who does he think he is?
there we are. And so he would laugh. He loved the attention. And we're talking about somebody who went around in full pancake makeup, looking like Bela Lugosi in full uniform. And he was allowed to do this. And my father would say, yeah, he looks like Bela Lugosi, which was my father's, you know, much more sophisticated understanding of that. And so when it comes to Michael Aquino, he was keeping track of me for quite a long time. And he almost certainly knew who I was in terms of my genetic background when I was traipsing around with my dad on the Presidio military base. And of course, also, I grew up a sickly child. And because we were growing up in the Tenderloin, I was exposed to all kinds of filth. Everything was seething with roaches and rats. And so I was constantly sick, and we were going to Letterman Army Medical Center. But because of the abuses at the Letterman Army Medical Center, where when I suffered a bleeding duodenal ulcer at the age of 14, a man named Dr. John Henry Hagman, who anyone can look up, who was affiliated with Michael Aquino, was responsible for a full body blood transfusion concerning myself. And my parents were told that the bleeding duodenal ulcer I had, that I was going to bleed out and die if I didn't get a blood transfusion, full body blood transfusion. And of course they wanted to save me, and they acquiesced to it. The reason they acquiesced to this artificial experimental blood transfusion was because the blood market had crashed. Because in those days, they used to take blood, believe it or not. What they used to do for blood banks was they used to pay out $20, the equivalent thereof, to homeless people and prostitutes who would give them a pint of blood, and they'd give them a donut afterwards so they could rebuild their blood back up. They'd take a pint of their blood, give them a donut. Yeah, and this led ultimately to the world blood market crashing.
It was also drug addicts and alcoholics and yeah.
Oh, yeah. When I use the term homeless, I mean, usually that's implied. I mean,
well, I knew people that were not homeless, but they would sell their blood to support their habit.
Mm-hmm. Or there are people who are homeless who are not necessarily drug addicts, etc. But nevertheless, you get the point. The general, yeah. So there you have it. And so a horrible experiment was performed on me. And just so people understand this, as I said before, the most highest paid constabulary in the world is the California prison guards, because the California prison guards have such a powerful lobby. California is one of the largest economies in the world. Our economy is the 5th largest in the world after the United States of America, Communist China, the Empire of Japan, and United Germany. And after that, it's California alone.
Yep.
Yeah, and the economy is larger than that of the Greater British Empire today. And so our economy is so large, we've got such a huge population, that our prison system is enormous. And so the California prison guards love it.
It's not just from that. It's from, we had some really excessive laws that were put in the 80s. That if you had 2 felony strikes, you could be put in for 25 years over stealing a pizza.
Yeah. Plus the 3 strikes and you're out, all
Yeah,
that.
that was what I was referring to, which was eventually found to be unconstitutional under the federal constitution.
Thank you.
So, but in the meantime, there were thousands of people who suffered under that system.
That's right. So we had a gulag. And in the
Yeah,
gulag,
we had a I called it a Gestapo system here, and it's recently had times where that system would be revived with different crimes. But we've had some really draconian laws in California, and the rest of the country doesn't understand that. They listen to the conservative press, and they see some stupid little thing, and they think that we've completely lost our minds. And the truth of the matter is, on most legal things, California is more conservative than anywhere else in the country. And we'll have 2 or 3 stupid things that everybody takes and runs with.
Yeah, they think California is super permissive. It's
not.
Yeah, there we are. And that thank you, honey. That's very important. And so my point with the California prison guards lobby was that they arranged for an unholy alliance with the U.S. Army at the Presidio military base, in particular because Letterman Army Medical Center was where 24%, fully a quarter of all U.S. Army doctors are trained. Now, understand, when you're a military doctor, you forsake the Hippocratic Oath because your job is to help win wars. The military's job is to break things and kill people. So there's no concept of a Hippocratic Oath in the U.S. military doctor system. And this is why they can conduct experiments on people with what they feel is impunity, moral impunity. And what would happen would be prisoners were given a chance at relief of certain punishments, perhaps a shortening of their sentence. We used to have a death sentence in California. And so a gubernatorial pardon from a death sentence was always a potential if the experiment was dangerous enough. But even some prison privileges for the lesser experiments, but prisoners were given the option of subjecting themselves to experiments at Letterman Army Medical Center in exchange for these deals. And so when I worked at the library, my job was to provide them reading materials because many of them would be isolated at the Letterman Army Medical Center. And so what Dr. John Henry Hagman told my parents was that this experimental plasma that he and his affiliates had, quote unquote, were trying to perfect it. He let my parents know it had killed every adult that had received a transfusion of it, of the California prison population who had volunteered for it. But he told them that because I was so young people are pliable and it might work with me. And there was no other option given them. And so they went ahead with it. And I died. I clinically died for about 24 to 48 hours. I was clinically dead. But then I reanimated. And I was bleached white.
Some of us are just not meant to stay dead.
Yes. And I was bleach white because until the bone marrow converts this synthetic plasma into your blood, it's not providing the coloration that normal plasma would provide. So I was bleach white, which is the color of death in Asia. So only my mother would love me. And all the other Asians ran away in fear. And it was at that moment that many people began to think I was dead or undead in the Asian community in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. So I took on a persona at that point. But one of the things that needs to be emphasized is that John Henry Hagman he's still on the loose. And he's obviously a war criminal because we are in a state of war with the 1,000-year Reich in exile. And so this is why we're on daylight saving time, which is wartime, which was established in World War I first, but lasted only a year. Once the American Expeditionary Forces came home, the public revolted in America and said, get us off this stupid wartime. But then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he ascended to power in 1933, the same year as Adolf Hitler across the Atlantic, he installed daylight saving time again. So he put America immediately on a war mobilization footing, and it was called wartime. And we are still on it because we have never ended World War II in terms of the Atlantic theater of conflict. We are still at war with the Thousand-Year Reich in exile. So all of that is the context.
Not necessarily, because my understanding was that Eisenhower did sign the treaty with the folks in Antarctica.
Yeah, that was a different kind of treaty. We could go into the nuances later on that. It's not denying what you're saying. It's certainly I was confronted with these realities when I was working with Michael Aquino, but it's almost the subject of an entire transmission in and of itself to do that justice. What the Americans were signing was, of course, a kind of a trade treaty, even though they were at war. And just so people understand this, the book, to put this in context, was written by a Jewish scholar and academic named Charles Higam. His surname is spelled Higham, and he wrote a book called Trading with the Enemy, in which he exposes the fact that throughout World War II, the American companies in general were engaging in trade with the Third Reich and the Empire of Japan, certainly the Third Reich and other Axis powers in particular. And so trading with the enemy was pointing out the fact that, yes, you can be in a state of total war and still be in an active state of trade, because business is business, no matter whether or not war is in place. So just an important point to make. So hopefully that puts that in some context. Do you understand?
Well, I had access to parts of the treaty, and it was not a trade treaty. So I'm not going to argue with you about it.
Yeah, no point going into there right now, and we can discuss that privately and hash out what exactly your understanding of this was compared with my own understanding of these affairs. But when it comes to the situation where we had Michael Aquino still in the military and then basically laterally transferring after the Gulf War, his career had already been brought to a kind of a standstill in the military because of my exposure. So when I had exposed him at that point, he had to laterally transfer to a much less attention target-rich environment, a much less target-rich environment. And he laterally transferred to the NSA, the National Security Agency. But the important thing to remember is during the time that I worked at the Presidio as basically at that point, a librarian's aide, and I was attending John O'Connell Vocational Institute as a commercial illustrator, student in commercial illustration, who in his internship was producing pornography, essentially, so that it could basically be proven that I'm putting my trade to work. And making money therefrom. Therefore, I was probably one of the few students at John O'Connell who was actually applying a trade. Probably, when I say a few, I mean like 2 or 3 students in the commercial illustration were probably doing it. None of the other shops were, and they call them shops. People were majoring in electronics. People were majoring in automobile repair. People were majoring in so-called aerodynamics. None of these people ever got jobs in any of those fields because there was no way to teach them anything that was adequate for employment. I know some of the people who were working in aerodynamics, which meant they were supposed to be able to repair planes, wound up simply pushing luggage over at the San Francisco airport. And that was all they did, was push luggage. They weren't repairing any planes. And of course, had they been allowed near the planes, it would have destroyed them simply by their incompetence. There was nothing there to train anybody with, and it was more like, they called it San Quentin Prep. It was just nothing but a place where students were literally tattooing each other. They were using the various machines to tattoo each other. And
San Quentin Prep?
Yes, yeah. People were shanking each other. A lot of gunfire. I'm not exaggerating. This is when I grew up in the...
no. When I moved from Fresno to where I live now, it was because the high school that my eldest was assigned to, there had been 4 murders on campus. So
Thank you. Yeah, and
He was going from 8th grade to 9th grade and was assigned to this particular high school. And because of at that point, Supreme Court ordered ethnicity requirements. We were not allowed to transfer to anyone anywhere safer. So I voted with my feet.
I don't blame you. Yes, and
It was not a matter of racism. It was a matter of my child's safety.
thank you. Yeah, and it was there you have it. So obviously, California. This is why the reactionaries and the conservatives all look at California and they'll say, "Oh, that's all due to your permissiveness, and you allow anybody to do anything, without an understanding of the gulag system here, etc." So there you have that. And it's a much more complicated.
We have a very complicated mix of things here, and it's for someone from another state to come in and try to figure it out. They're lost usually.
Oh yeah,
and easily victimized because the rules work for those who are here.
Yes,
but you have to understand them to stay out of trouble.
Yes, it's exactly. So when it comes to the situation at John O'Connell and how I met Michael Aquino, understand that, as I said, it was in that year that I was producing commercial illustration that there was several things that happened that were decisive. One of the things that happened, either right before or right after I entered John O'Connell, there was a MK Ultra, just to use the generic term. There's a mind control psyops victim named Dan White, who was a former San Francisco police officer who had been raised a Irish Catholic, and he basically was angry because a gay man named Harvey Milk had taken his job as San Francisco supervisor. And there were several San Francisco supervisors, but had taken his particular job. And in terms of Harvey Milk himself, we're talking about somebody who had his own bizarre background, because Harvey Milk was obviously gay. He was rendered into sainthood by Hollywood and the gay media lobby, where they portrayed him as in a hagiography, the making of a saint, basically, by Sean Penn. But Harvey Milk is someone who was in the U.S. Navy during the Korean War, and he was what they called a frogman, which in those days was a UDT, an underwater demolitions team expert. And so he basically has a ship named after him, the Harvey Milk, the USS Harvey Milk.
Did they really name a ship?
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that one.
Oh, you can look that up.
He was one of those guys that, had he not been shot, he would have been a nothing burger.
Yes. Well, he, aside from that, he was a pedophile, and they've got him on U.S. stamps. He was someone who, it is definitively proven, this isn't like slander or defamation of character. The guy was proven to take young boys home. I mean, San Francisco was seething with young runaways. And so he would take young boys home and offer them shelter. And there's several young, men who later came out and said, yes, he took advantage of me when I was younger and I had no choice because I needed food and shelter. And so we're talking about this kind of individual. And it's only fitting, of course, the U.S. Navy names a ship after him. And he's one of the founding fathers of the U.S. Navy SEALs. So you're talking about, because the U.S. Navy SEALs were originally frogmen. They were originally the UDT, underwater demolitions teams, and then they evolved into, or devolved into, this kind of SEAL trip. And so there you go. And so Dan White killed him, along with the mayor of San Francisco. So there was this one woman who was not the official secretary of George Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, but she was known as the lap secretary. In other words, she was doing all kinds of gopher jobs for him. Yeah, and she was essentially servicing him under the table. But she happened to be
That's what immediately came to mind with that title. Yes. Oh
Yeah.
my. They
Yeah.
actually called her that.
Well, that nobody said that to her face, but it was
Um,
pretty much everybody said that, and she knew that. She worked at City Hall, and she was definitely on the employment roster in some kind of financial office or something. But this was because she had to run to the bank and get money for Moscone or Harvey Milk, etc. So she had to have that capacity. So, but she was sitting at the front desk in front of the reception's place. She was sitting in the reception's place because the real secretary wasn't always there. And indeed, there may not have been a real secretary. She may have fulfilled all those functions, but nobody really respected her as such. It was not that she didn't deserve it, but you understand what I'm saying. What I mean to say is I did not think she deserved to be denigrated, but it was she just was in a position where for a woman, respect is hard to find anyway. And in a situation like
yes.
that, yeah. And but anyhow, so she was at the front desk when Dan White walked in one day, just before I got into John O'Connell, or yeah, it was before. It was definitely before. So what happened was that when Dan White walked in, she got up to stop him, and he pushed her to the ground and said, "I'm too much of a gentleman to shoot a lady." And he proceeded into the mayor's office and blew out George Moscone's brains and the brains of Harvey Milk. And he never spent a day in jail. He went to trial, and they said that he had simply eaten too many Twinkies. They called it the Twinkie defense.
Yeah, they called it the Twinkie defense, and that was one of the things that they denigrate California for.
Yes, yes. Well, that's understandable. That one's understandable.
That one is understandable. Yes, there have been some things that have completely baffled me, and I grew up here.
Yes, thank you. Now, in terms of Dan White, he went home, spent the next 7 years pretty much to himself, essentially, and then finally one day somebody flipped a switch and he blew his brains out. Probably because he was getting ready to talk or write a book or something. But in terms of Dan White,
it's interesting because there are several of us in various disclosure communities that are having trouble writing books.
Of course, yeah. Believe me, I was there.
It's the programming is such that you start to write it and you just get this level of absolute fucking panic.
Yes.
You can write about anything else.
Yeah, but yourself.
But yourself.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That's true. So when it came to Dan White, that's pretty much it. But the secretary, Leanne Prifty, she was Albanian, and she spoke the Albanian language, ̔shqiptari. The actual ethnos of Albania. Albania is a nation. The ethnos, or the people who live there, are ̔shqiptari, and the ̔shqiptari it really means caveman, believe it or not, because there's so many caves. There's so many caves in Albania. And but the language is Illyrian, as in the ancient Illyrian language. So she spoke that. And so she worked with the State Department, not just the city and county of San Francisco. She worked with the State Department for America Free Radio. In other words, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free America. So she would broadcast American propaganda behind the Iron Curtain into communist Albania, which at that time was radically collectivist and allied with Maoist China. And so while she was doing that, she also knew many things that were going on at the Presidio military base because she worked with the State Department. Of course, later on, I found out she was an affiliate of Aquino's. And so she told me, why don't you get a summer job at the Presidio military base since you're a military dependent? In other words, until you're 21 years of age, you have a military ID card if you're the child of someone who's a career military man. And this enables you to take advantage of the hospital, get free medical care, and shop in the commissary or the post exchange, the PX, so long as you have your ID. And so she says, since you've got the ID for access to the base, why don't you get this job at the library? You'll be making out like a bandit with this summer job. And so I wound up getting a summer job at the Presidio military base library as a librarian's aide. Within a short period of time, I had progressed to a military reference technician and then ultimately to a Department of Defense research librarian. I have the credit equivalent of a master's degree in library science from the University of San Jose, which is the only place that you can get a degree in in library science in California. By the way, this is one of the things that people would notice is that whenever you see the madman Stephen Outram on his colon column, where there's just thousands and thousands of pages that this individual is writing about myself and bragging about his affiliation with Michael Aquino, one of the things that you'll see is the straw man technique, where, like the Marine Corps, he'll claim things that are patently absurd and say that I said them. And all he does is he changes all of the facts around. And the insanity of this is I can only imagine that a person must be stark raving mad to even do that, because I can't imagine the mental energy that goes into that. But say, for instance, when I talked about West Point, where while all the child molestation was going down at the Presidio military base daycare center, it was also going on at every military base that the Americans had established all over the world. One of them was West Point, and I've said on record, the child daycare center building at West Point is building number 666. That was the building at the time it was serving as a daycare center. When Rudy Giuliani was sent to investigate and wound up basically covering up for the military. And when it came to this idiot, Stephen Outram, he'll say,
Giuliani has covered up for a lot of things over the years.
Yes. And when it comes to Stephen Outram, he'll claim Douglas Dietrich says the child daycare center building at the Presidio military base was building number 666, which, of course, it's on record. I've never said that. You can watch Satan's Crusaders video on my channel. Just look up the Douglas Dietrich channel and you can watch the video Satan's Crusaders, and you'll see that I reference West Point. Other things, say, for instance, like it's just every fact imaginable. They'll just twist it and turn it around and say Douglas Dietrich said this, something I've never said. And but if you follow everything that I say, you'll find out that what I said is factual and verifiable. So there we have that. The other thing is that when it comes to the situation with Michael Aquino, he eventually requested that I become his liaison. In other words, his gopher, to serve him directly with various responsibilities. And so within a very short period of time, I was working for him on very directly and very personally. So that was how that came about. And he basically told me, he would admonish me at various times to remember that people died in order for me to get that job. Now, here's what happened.
How did that happen?
Oh, he's talking about the killing of the mayor and the killing of the supervisor, Harvey Milk, because that's when the mayoress, Dianne Feinstein, became mayoress. Understand, all of our listeners, Dianne Feinstein was never elected to San Francisco mayoralty. She only got the position because people were killed. And then she succeeded by just being next in line. So when she became mayoress, the first thing she did was get rid of Leanne Prifty. Because there were rumors, of course, that she was a dyke, meaning Dianne Feinstein, and she was desperate to prove she wasn't a dyke. So the first thing she did when she came into power was she says, "Oh, I'm not a lesbian. I don't need no fucking lap secretary, so you're fired." So she got rid of Leanne Prifty. I mean, out of City Hall, period. I mean, not like you're fired from this position. You're fired, period, out of City Hall. And Leanne Prifty wound up working at John O'Connell Vocational Institute. That's how I met her. So I wound up meeting this woman who was the former secretary of the mayor of San Francisco, who gets his brains blown out by someone who's obviously mind controlled. She winds up working at John O'Connell, where I'm attending school. She's the one who gets me the job at the Presidio military base. And so even though it's not exactly that, it was more that Michael Aquino wanted Feinstein to be mayoress than to pull that collateral stunt off, but to give people some hint of how Dianne Feinstein served him. As I mentioned in the past, when I was working at the Presidio military base, at the library, the postal library, the main postal library, there was more than one library. There was the library, and then there was the Letterman Army Medical Center's hospital library. So I was collaborating between the two libraries, but I was a librarian at the main postal library. And it was there that we had a children's room. And in the children's room, I see Penny looking around. Are you looking for something?
Yeah, like coffee cup.
Your
Don't
coffee
panic.
cup. Yes, yes. So
I have someone I live with who was graciously refilling my coffee cup.
there we are. Yes. Hello to Lou, wonderful Lou, and
Yes, wonderful, Lou.
yes, and it's actually two cats that live in the house. The people are just there as collateral. They're just there to serve the cats.
Yeah. We have two cats, and they think they own the place, and that we are their servants. And Lou is busy wandering around, making small amounts of noise. And if I turn off my mic, it's because of what he's doing. So
Okay, that's fine. That's adorable. So when it came to where was I? I was talking about what?
you were talking about Leanne, where you get your high school.
Yeah. So when it came to Feinstein. So when I was working at the Presidio military base and we had a children's room.
I blank out on Feinstein. She is.
Yeah, understood.
She
Which is repulsive. She's repulsive. And
my understanding is that before all of this, that she was actually homeless for some time and living in her car.
I find that hard to believe since she's a spoiled Jewish American princess. So that strikes me as...
Everybody has problems.
I hear you, but still, it's one of those things where, let's put it this way. She's got full-blown Alzheimer's dementia now, and she's still in power. They keep her there because without that, the Democrats lose that seat. So, but she's demonstrated
there's a lot of people in both houses of Congress for that very reason.
That's true. Yeah. But she's at this point, she's clinical. And so how much longer they can keep that up, who knows? But in terms of her, what happened was that when she became mayoress, at the same time, I was dealing with these all of these sex murderers and child rapists at the Presidio. One of them was U.S. Army Special Forces Green Beret Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez, who was sentenced to methadone treatments at Letterman Army Medical Center. And knowing all of these GIs who blew their wives away, killed their families and got away with it because, the judge will say, oh, you're a veteran, you've done so much for your country. Oh, I know you've got PTSD, so you killed your wife and kids. All right, and they just give them, basically a slap on the wrist. In the case of Michael Ramirez, he was sentenced to methadone treatments, but he had a shoebox full of memories of all of these young Vietnamese girls he had killed in Vietnam while sexually assaulting them to death. By the way, this is U.S. Army Special Forces Green Berets, the same branch of service that Michael Aquino was an officer of. So anybody who's got any John Wayne fantasies that these people are heroes, you're out of your fucking mind. Just think of Michael Aquino and Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez and the two Mikeys, and you've got an idea of what the U.S. Army Special Forces Green Berets was really all about. So he had the shoebox full of photographs of girls that he had butchered while having sex with them and defiling them, that is. And so he was trying to take it into the children's room all the time to share with the kids. And when I was on duty, I would prevent him from doing that. One of the ways you would do that would be to engage him in conversation. And when I looked at the photographs myself, which was a way of engaging him, and I asked him, how did you finally get busted killing your wife? Because most guys just get away with it. They're not even brought to a trial. And he said, oh, I killed her in front of my nephew. And he was telling me how my nephew really loved these photographs. He'd take them to the cemetery and lean against a headstone and jack off over them under the full moon. And I said, oh, who was your nephew? Oh, Richard Ramirez. So his nephew was the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. Now, Richard Ramirez, was running a reign of terror in California.
Yeah, the Night Stalker terrorized California for a while.
Yeah, and he was using a firearm. And he was using but a single firearm. And the single firearm that he was using, the police finally were able to trace it. And they had just one more murder and they would catch him. The next time he used it, they knew that they were going to be able to nab him. And that's when Dianne Feinstein got on national television and warned him about it. Dianne Feinstein got on national television and told Richard Ramirez, watch out, they've got your gun, they're going to trace you down. And that's when he started using a different firearm with every murder. So it was Michael Aquino who told me he gave her the orders to do that so that Michael Ramirez's nephew, Richard Ramirez, could continue. So Dianne Feinstein is obviously a cultist of Michael Aquino's, and was obviously, those people were really killed so she could become the mayoress and ultimately a state senator. And so there we have that. There's some proof for you right there of a conspiracy. And for those of you, just to put all this in perspective,
I will say for the record that I have investigated a lot of conspiracies, and about 90% of them have been fact-based.
Well,
they have not necessarily, and this is the ones out in the public, they have not necessarily turned out to be completely correct, but that they have been based in actual facts. So using that as a term of insult is a little bit weird.
Yeah. Well, and then just to give people some perspective on this, so Michael Aquino himself, now people understand how I met him. It was through the job I got at the library. Ultimately, he requested that I start working with him. And the reason he requested that was obviously because he had had an eye on myself for a long time. And certainly while I was growing up, it was obvious I was being monitored. When my parents would be gone from the apartment in the Tenderloin and I was by myself, the phone would ring and then adults would say, oh, we're taking a survey. And because I'm just a kid who enjoyed talking, I would talk to them while we went through these long ass surveys. And it didn't even make any sense because, of course, somebody who's under the age of 18, nobody surveys them for anything. But I was thinking that this, was just something normal. But obviously, this was a form of monitoring. And so obviously, Aquino had had his eye on me for some time. Certainly, he was involved with the Dr. John Henry Hagman blood transfusion, total body blood transfusion incident, because Dr. John Henry Hagman referenced him. At that time was the first time I heard Aquino's name and realized who he was in connection with the person who walked around the base looking like Dracula was through John Henry Hagman. Yeah, so
sorry, I think that you're giving Dracula a bad rap.
Thank you. I mean, the Hollywood caricature that Bela Lugosi has left in our minds, and even that is imbuing too much dignity and romance onto the subject at hand. Thank you. But so people understand this. Michael Aquino was somebody who was raising an army of serial killers. One of them was the Zodiac Killer, who, for those of you who don't know, the Zodiac Killer, whenever he was spotted, eyewitnesses reported him in full military uniform. In his case, it was the Vietnam era camouflage or surplus, which wasn't really camouflage. It was olive drab, but in some cases there were camouflage pattern on certain types of gear, etc. But he was always spotted as if he were in combat, and all of his footprints that were left on the crime scenes were military grade issue boots. And you might say, oh, he's just somebody who's shopping at surplus centers. It's his familiarity with it all, and the way he was spotted, the way he was wearing it. Like, for instance, for those of you who aren't familiar with the military, they basically blouse their trousers, which means that they have to have a little like rubber band that ties the bottom cuffs of your pants into your boots so you don't get mud in your socks. This way your blouse trousers prevent mud from getting in your socks. People spotted him with blouse trousers. In other words, he had a military background. It's not something a normal person would do who didn't have a military background, the way he presented himself. And so this was obviously basically a soldier who's terrorizing people in the civilian world at home on what Aquino called the home front. Another example was Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., who was basically the typical trip of somebody who starts off as a military man and then becomes a police officer. And I've always warned that this should not happen. Even though I was in the military and served in the San Francisco Police Department, this is not a transition that should happen. And my own experience proved to me that that was the case. The military is trained for an entirely different function. A police officer is a peace enforcement agent. Their job is to keep the peace. They're maintaining the peace.
That's a problem that I'm seeing in a lot of arenas. I don't know if it is so much outside of California, but even here, even in the casinos that are run by sovereign Native American tribes, they will prefer those folks who have military training. And all that gets you is someone who is trained to kill.
Thank you.
Not someone who is trained to resolve situations.
Thank you. Thank you. These are not problem solvers.
No.
There's only one solution that they have. Yeah. So with Joseph James DeAngelo, he was traumatized at a young age. When he was 9 years of age, he was growing up on a military base. And he grew up on military bases, period. His father was stationed in Korea and in West Germany. And in the case of West Germany, his 7-year-old sister, when he was 9 years old, was gang raped in front of him by a group of officers in uniform. And so this hypersexualized him as a child. He wound up serving in the military, becoming a police officer, and he was responsible for killing hundreds of people throughout California. And then they brought him into justice, if you can call it that, when he's too senile to understand even what's going on. He's got full-blown Alzheimer's dementia, and you're talking about somebody who's 75 years old. And so they brought him in and basically said, oh, now we can arrest him now that he's 75. What they're doing is they're putting him into a hospice or a retirement center. In other words, your tax dollars are going to support him living another 10 years on your tax dollars, whether he's senile or not, with people wiping his ass and serving him food and bathing him and maintaining him the rest of his life. That's what they're doing. So this is an example of the monsters of the military. This is what the military produces. So this is what Aquino called his little league, or his army of serial killers. So this should be frightening to people.
Yeah,
I mean,
how did he pull this off? Was this his own private army, or was the overstructure?
It was both. It was both. It was basically what had happened was that when the Vietnam War ended, it was a very long process because it had been a very long war. It was never declared. And obviously what happened was Nixon made himself very popular by Vietnamizing the war and saying we're pulling America out. That was 1973, but in 1975.
Mine was the last graduating class that was subject to the draft.
I'm sorry, who was the last subject in class that was subject to the draft?
My graduating class from high school was the last year that the draft was in force.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I do remember that. That is what makes me a boomer, because the boys my age were subject to the draft.
Yes.
And that does give you a different worldview, because starting our junior year, these guys had to sit there and figure out, well, what's going to happen? What am I going to do? What's my number? What are my odds of being taken? Do I want to go kill people, or am I going to run to Canada and start over there? Or, some of them got so demoralized that they never did anything with the rest of their lives because they were terrified that they were going to be sent there.
Yeah, no, it was, though, to put this into perspective for people, all of that is quite true. And the psychological fear was palpable. And the reality was that a young man could not get a job because anywhere he went, the employer would say, well, you're draft age. Why would I hire you? You could get drafted any day. This is what caused many young men to say, fuck it, and they volunteered. But just so people know, the total opposite of World War II. In World War II, 2/3 of all the millions of men who served were draft A's. 2/3 of them were draft A's. Only 1/3 of them volunteered. In the Vietnam War, only 1/3 were actually draft A's. 2/3 of them were volunteers. Just so people understand.
Because if they volunteered, they got options that they didn't get as a draftee.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the rich kids were still given the opportunity that as long as they were going to college and maintaining at least a C, they would have an exemption.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's all of this is true.
So it was a situation where it was the poor who were fighting this war.
Oh yeah, very much so. Very much so. Class exploitation. Oh, by the way, and this is why in all of the films you see at that time, all the men having adventures, going out and playing spy, all of these guys are older guys. That's the reason why. It's because all the young men are basically being drafted or volunteering for the military service. So you see all the Playboy spy movies of the 60s that everybody was watching at that time. These are all older guys. I mean, like guys who would be considered...
Those were guys' sex dreams.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, of course. That too.
Realistically, you know, nobody is going to be treated like James Bond.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, reality is.
Yes. And by the way, that reminds me of the computers, and you can see that as well in those films. They were only huge mainframes with very low power ratings. And
when I got out of junior college, I worked for Tulare County in their data processing unit, and we had an entire room that had to be kept at 60 degrees or less.
Yes.
And it had less computing power than the cell phone you have in your pocket.
Yes, it was,
it cost $50 an hour to operate.
Yes.
In 1975 money, when minimum wage was $1.65 an hour.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And I had this one idiot that was on Revolution Radio. I brought him on at one point, and this motherfucker had worked basically. This is what happens with these guys in the military, and why they're so fucking useless. So many of them is when you're in the military, you're given these positions that make you feel incredibly responsible. In his case, he was like somebody who would sign off on the NATO reports. So he was stationed in West Germany, and the NATO reports were sent to the president, but he was just a sergeant at the level of a sergeant, and his job was to collate the documents that were to be sent to Richard Nixon and just sign off on them to make certain all the documents were in the right order. And so people would tell him, you know, the president sees your signature on this, on these forms. You know, they would tell him that. I mean, nothing is going to make a man feel more important than that in life. There's no job you can get in the civilian world. And so what happens is these guys get out of that kind of a job, which they have for just a few years. And then unless they make a career in the military, they go into the civilian world and they feel like everything they do is just shit. And so they start doing all kinds of crazy, stupid stuff. And trying to make themselves feel important again. Great example of that is Ed Danes, who was just in the military for a short period of time, was considered a fucking joke, and then went out and did all this remote viewing bullshit to make himself feel important again. And that was, I went into that.
You know, some of the remote viewers actually do see.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about remote viewing as a technique being, I'm talking about Ed Dane.
Oh, okay. You're applying to the individual. Per our agreement prior to the show starting,
I'm dying over here. I'm dying. I'm
Odin
dying.
was making signals at me about us taking a break, and my coffee has gone through, so I would very much appreciate it.
Okay. Shall I also go mute and come back in a few moments?
Oh, sure.
Yes.
You have about how about this? Let's make it a 4-minute break for the Nacht Waffen pilot show by Miss Penny Bradley with her super special I Am Telling the Truth guest. Because this man ain't telling no lies when he's like, this motherfucker. I mean, come on. You can't get no better radio than this.
You came up with that, and Daryl lost it. And I'm sitting here trying to not bust up laughing watching Daryl.
I knew it was something.
I am dying. I love you both. Take a 4-minute break, because guess what? We'll be right back on Nacht Waffen Pilot with the great and powerful Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, Mr. 3D himself. We'll be right back. Oh my God, I'm dying.
Play the music.
have returned. Hey, I hope y'all understood. It's time to start the show. And by the way, Facebook, once again, YouTube, once again, I got the rights to run Silo. And if you got a problem with that, let me give you my boy who will tell you. I, them, we are
we've
one.
had some issues with some of the music, haven't we, hon?
Oh yeah, but guess what? You know something? Both those songs, I give the dedication to you both because you know why? Because Penny, you're glitter. Douglas, you're gold. Together, y'all a team. I mean, y'all could be the tag team champions like The Undertaker and Kane. The Midnight Express. The Rock and Roll Express. Y'all two are better than the Moondogs. Y'all two are better than, well, I can't say the Four Horsemen. Because I'm sorry.
Well, there's 4 of them.
Yeah, there's 4 of them. But y'all will come in good competition. I mean, y'all remind me of Mr. Wrestler number 2. And, oh, let me give you the better show. Penny, you're China. And Douglas, you are Triple H. You two together in a ring will clear the ring out. Or you could be called Axe and Smash or Demolition. Or maybe.
You know, I remember the days of Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth.
Oh.
So I don't know who these names are.
Yeah. Don't forget, snap into a Slim Jim, baby. Ooh. Yeah.
So yeah, Miss Elizabeth was his manager.
Yeah.
So I have gone to more than one party dressed as Miss Elizabeth.
I bet you have, Miss Elizabeth. All right, back to the show, everybody. Hey, Douglas, you're hitting them hard, brother. I'm telling you the truth. And last but not least, why does this cat want to be on TV all the time? Get the stepping kid. You're talking to me.
Show. Let it sit there, meow.
Yeah.
Well, she's in heat, but that's okay. She thinks I'm special.
You didn't get your babies fixed?
She's not fixed, but she will be next week, boy. I tell you right now, she's got me. Yeah.
My girls, when they hit that 4-month period where they started yowling all the time and hissing at one another, they had a nice little trip to the vet.
This one is going to be going to something, and the vet is probably the first place that she may find herself. The next place may be, never mind. Don't be calling animal rights on me, people, because I'm going to give her rights. I'm going to give her rights. She might see last rights.
Well, my girls are indoor kitties, and they have not interacted with male kitties at all, and we knew they were not going to, so there was no reason to allow them to go through that kind of misery. So,
ladies and gentlemen, this is the great and powerful Douglas Dietrich. Oh, Penny, you got to tell them that the Penny Bradley Global Conspiracy Radio Network will be in existence and alive on the 8th of November. The 8th of November, it will be alive. And guess what, people? Regardless of whether he says it or not, Douglas Dietrich will be there every Sunday. So guess what? The party is just beginning.
Yes, we're going to have our own network of
Wonderful.
conspiracy theory, and it's going to be folks from various outlier realms. All of us will be speaking the truth, and it will be up to the public to decide who they want to listen to, because we're basically vetting people by how truthful they are, rather than how outlandish what they're saying sounds.
Well, let me tell you the truth. Right now, Douglas Dwayne Dietrich is real. He's a brick.
Yes.
Look, he's no better than my mug. And I love my mug to death. I swear to God. She's empty right now.
I noticed you emptied that thing pretty fast.
Yeah, you know, Silo does it to me. And Penny Bradley certified, bona fide, rectified like Douglas Dwayne Dietrich. So guess what? If I have to do a network and it's just those two, oh, hold on. I forgot there's one mysterious person going to be there. Your Valkyrie. See, I mean, as Odin, I got to have a Valkyrie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So tell them about
Odin
the
has to
Valkyrie.
have a couple of Valkyries.
Yeah.
I
Right.
recall there have to be several.
Yeah,
Yes.
at least I got one Valkyrie that's going to be there. And last but not least, I definitely going to tell you, this side of the network is going to be global as global is, and going to be as popular as global is. And just the fact that I have thought about, my mother cried when I said, you know something, I got to give Penny her due. I got to give Penny her monument, because she suffered just like Douglas Dwayne Dietrich has suffered because of people not believing. I mean, it's just like the child that says, he touched me, and you don't believe him. And then you later find out, 20 years later, you go to Europe and you find out that the Catholic Church priests were touching your little baby. Okay, you're 90 years old, and what can you do about it? But you know something? Now we're giving monuments to people. We're issuing. Listen, forget your woke ass scenario people out there. The bottom line is, these people are real, and the reason why they're real is because you were not out there looking to stop the problem. And that's the issue I'm having. Douglas Dwayne Dietrich was out there. He was a young boy. He was a young man. He grew up, and he suffered a lifetime of misery because no one stood up and said no. That's the issue. No one stood up for him. Well, I'm standing up for him. I'm standing up for Penny. Penny was suffered through her life. No one stood up for Penny. We've all suffered, but no one stands. I thought this was America. No, you just turned into a, as Douglas would say, a pussy-ass society bent on your own individual destruction because you got your own individual agendas and initiatives. The bottom fucking line is, I don't give a damn what you think anymore. American public, you decide your own fate. Me, Douglas, Penny, we're making it. And you cannot stop us. Because why?
Yeah. Because
we love you.
If it weren't about the kids, I wouldn't even be bothering anybody. But the same crap they did to me in 1959, they're still doing to kids all over the world.
Why you got all these missing children?
To be stopped. You remember when I interviewed Herr Mayor?
Yes.
His 5-year-old daughter was telling him about what happened when she was abducted and taken to what she called secret spy school.
Is that proof for you people out there? I know that the SSP people
there was
understand.
a family in Texas that contacted me in January. Their 4-year-old son was screaming that he refused to go back to sleep because he didn't want to go back into space again. And he was quite eloquent about it. You know, this shit is still ongoing. That's why I'm still talking.
Penny, this is the horror of Halloween right here.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
Douglas, I know you got the horrors of Halloween. I mean, if anybody heard the first half of the show, you understand Douglas went through the horrors of Halloween completely.
Yeah, he did.
And you know something?
And for folks who don't understand, well, why is Penny talking about Colonel Aquino? My community refers to him as the West Coast Mengele because of his involvement in mind fracturing children in California.
Yes. Yeah.
So we're not talking about something that's for entertainment. We're talking about one of the most horrible people that has ever walked the face of the earth, and he has absolute relevance to both Douglas and I about what we're talking about.
Yes. So let's get into some of that horror. I believe that we really haven't actually gone into the horror just yet, and I appreciate both of you so much, and certainly we'll be happy to participate in your new station, and just keep me up to date on that.
I will, Douglas, and to know something,
Yeah.
I wish that the people out there who have not or have no knowledge of this situation that you and Penny are talking about, I wish them to know it. Maybe they will learn the truth. Maybe they will wake up one morning and say, this shit has to stop. Maybe they will wake up and say, damn these three-letter agencies coming into my house, taking my children, or these people gearing life or directing life, or what they call fating life, for people that have innocence. Innocence, man. You stealing a child's innocence. Come on. There are bigger issues out there.
They're taking children between the ages of 2 and 12 and mind fracturing them before they ever have a chance at any kind of a life. And the more talented they think this person is going to be, the younger they are when they take them. So, like, I was completely fractured at age 4 and never given a chance to be the person I was supposed to be.
Jim Jones. If you don't understand out there listening, Jim Jones. Somebody just Jim Jones your ass.
So you have to look at this. No matter where you think my Black Ops service was, I was still kidnapped. I was still mind fractured. I have still been used in programs against my will for the rest of my life. And this is why I talk. It's not to talk about the glories of some fucking battle out in space that may or may not even be real. What I'm talking about is children, little kids, being taken out of their beds without their parents' consent. It would be bad enough if it were with their parents' consent, but it's not. These agencies are putting the whole family to sleep and then coming in and taking the kid they want.
Yes.
And you wake up the next morning and your kid has amnesia and doesn't even know who you are and has serious psychological problems from that point forward. And you have no idea what happened to them or how to deal with it or any idea of how to treat it, because my family didn't even believe in amnesia.
That's awful. That's just awful. I truly appreciate that. So to bring it to the thread so that we don't lose the thread of narrative, because that's important. One of the things that I wanted to drive home was the impact that Aquino had on the world before I go back into the more grisly details of exactly what he did. So that people understand, when, again, I was in John O'Connell Vocational Institute, practicing my trade in commercial illustration. My teacher at the time was Gary Willard Hambright, who was ultimately federally indicted by a federal grand jury for his assaults against children at the Presidio daycare center. Just so people understand the perspective of this, as with the case of Gary Willard Hambright and the case of the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, who was a policeman of the highest rank for his department and loose throughout California. When I use the term killing hundreds, understand that the number of people that a murderer is convicted for, or an assailant, is not the number of people that they've harmed. When you look them up, you'll probably find about 13 murdered, half 100 raped, and 120 they'll say were burgled. The reality is there are literally, as I said, he himself confessed to hundreds of murders. They just haven't found the bodies yet, so they can only convict him for the bodies that they found and genetically trace to him through DNA. So he's not convicted for the majority of his crimes. And as for Gary Willard Hambright, he was convicted for assaults against no less than 14 children. All of them were under 4 years of age. And they all died of AIDS because he infected everyone he raped with AIDS. And he would have been convicted for raping hundreds more had he not died of AIDS himself. So they never finished the conviction process, which would have gone on for years. So understand that ultimately, when it came to someone like Gary Willard Hambright alone, who had full-blown AIDS, not just HIV positive, but full-blown AIDS, and was having sex with extremely young children, who then went on themselves to die. This was back when AIDS was a death sentence. Understand that the number of victims this man produced was ultimately 5,000. He probably killed around 5,000 children, and he was defended by Michael Aquino for the rest of Michael Aquino's life, which was bizarre to me because Michael Aquino could easily have thrown him under the bus and just said, see, it was all this guy and I had nothing to do with it. But instead, he chose to stay by that individual as if they had a bond. So, and
there may have been some sort of blood.
Oh, there was. Yeah. See, all of the children, of course, you said that. And when the children were interviewed by the FBI, hundreds of children from the Presidio military base, all of them described, or rather the overwhelming majority of them described, being taken to Michael Aquino's home, which is in walking distance from my own home. Everybody knows my address as 1242 Green Street, 1242 Green Street in San Francisco. And of course, when it comes to Michael Aquino's address, and of course he no longer lived there after I exposed him, he had to move. And ultimately spent the rest of his life kind of like on the run in a sense. He would relocate a lot to different countries, actually. Was going first to the East Coast and then to Scotland, where he owned a castle or purchased a castle. And then he moved finally to Canada, and based on my understanding, I understand he died in Canada. But where he lived in San Francisco for many, many years was 2430 Leavenworth, 2430 Leavenworth Street. So he's literally was in walking distance of my home. Now, for all of you idiots out there who think that somehow implicates myself as having always known this people, and that we're bosom buddies or something, understand that San Francisco is the most congested city in the United States next to New York City. Everything is in walking distance, you dumb fucks who grow up in other areas. That's why so many people here don't own a car. You could theoretically walk from one end of San Francisco to the other, which I used to do when I was younger. Wouldn't dream of doing it now. But in terms of San Francisco, yeah, you could walk the four corners. And the majority of it was consistent of the Presidio military base, which if it were not for the advent of Silicon Valley, San Francisco would have died and withered away with my closing, getting the Presidio military base closed and shut down. So understand that when the kids were taken from the daycare center to Aquino's home, the FBI would drive these kids all over San Francisco to confuse them, take them down the crookedest street in the world to really discombobulate them. But the children were still able to identify 2430 Leavenworth whenever they were driven by it. By the way, it's very distinctive, as is Michael Aquino himself, or was, and it is a very castle-looking place. He purchased it because it looked so Gothic. Now, basements are only half below ground in San Francisco. It's like New York City, where people live in those death traps, where they all drowned in the recent hurricane, or rather the nor'easter that flooded it. So if you take a look at the basements in San Francisco, the ground is so hard, they're only slightly underground, and then the rest of the basements are above ground. And with that 2430 Leavenworth, it's like several levels of basement. It's all above ground, but it's all stoned in with actual stone castle-like construction. So it looks like one of those Japanese castles that have that high layer of stone above the ground before you even get to the castellated structure. And that's exactly how it's built. So the kids all pointed that out, and they described the interior. They said it was black on the inside. Everything was painted black. The living room, the lounge, everything was black. And they were all taken to a room that was completely covered in soundproof padding so that they could scream at the top of their lungs and no one would hear them scream. And of course, Michael Aquino was identified. The children always said that Mikey was there, along with, of course, the individual who was my commercial illustration instructor, Gary Willard Hambright. And so they would always force the children, to reference Michael Aquino as Mikey, and his wife, Lilith, was always dressed as a man, whereas Michael Aquino and Gary Willard Hambright were dressed as women. And so in this manner, they would rape and assault the children. Now, anybody could think these are childhood fantasies, but when the police raided Michael Aquino's home, and I know the inspector who raided Michael Aquino's home, Inspector Glenn Pamphloff of the San Francisco Police Department, they said everything the children described was exactly as the children described it, that the inside of his home, the lobby was all painted black, that the soundproof room was there, covered in blood and shit and the remnants of all kinds of human bodily fluids that had been splattered from the kids' bodies as they were disassembled, at least in part. And on the roof was, as the children described, a crucifix. And when I asked Inspector Pamphloff, what do you think that the crucifix on the ceiling was about? That was the first time he ever broke into tears, and told me that was so that the children could look up and know that God was watching and enjoying every minute of their suffering, and that he was, their true God was literally Satan, that they were created simply as toys for the pleasure of their tormentors. This is the kind of indoctrination that they were given. Now you've got people who participated in this, the individuals named Francis and Dan Keller, who were just released out of prison in Texas. And this was against the protestations of all their victims. All their victims at their daycare center that they ran protested against their release. And among the atrocities that they committed while running the daycare center out of their Texas home was drowning and dismembering babies in front of those children, killing dogs and cats in front of the children, transporting the children to Mexico to be sexually abused by soldiers in the Mexican army, and dressing as pumpkins and shooting children in the arms and legs, and putting the children in a pool with sharks that ate babies, and putting blood in the children's Kool-Aid, or cutting the arm or finger off a gorilla at a local park, and exhuming bodies at a cemetery and forcing children to carry the bones. Now think about what I'm saying. Your average child at a very young age, how would they know about an international demarcation point like a border, let alone that they were being raped by troops of a foreign army, aside from the fact that they might be speaking a different language? Are children that adept at identifying uniforms? This is the kind of thing that children cannot make up. All of this happened. But not only were Francis and Dan Keller released after 21 and a half years in prison, they were declared, by the way, this is to drive this point home. Understand, of course, that the American culture, and I don't say this from some evangelical perspective, anybody who knows me knows that would not be the case, but American culture, in terms of the people who founded the constitutional republic ultimately, or the culture from which that is derived, were obviously fanatical Christians. The Puritans were so fanatical that Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, the leader of the militant Puritan movement that was so extreme, they beheaded their own king. Oliver Cromwell couldn't stand these fuckers. And he said, God, these Christians are fucking crazy. The ones who went into ecstatic trances, they called them Shakers and Quakers and shit, because they were all shaken out in this orgasmic ecstasy in their communion with the Christ. And he said, let's get them out of England. So they kicked their asses out, and they had to cross the Atlantic and come to America. And that's why America is so butt-fuck crazy. But aside from that, it was Christian. So you've got...
I will say that Cromwell attacked my family in Europe, and that the survivors of his purge came to the Carolinas and Virginia rather than Pennsylvania, where the Quakers and Shakers were.
Now, was that Sir Oliver Cromwell?
Yes.
Okay, you know something? I just came back in from the back end of it because I was in the other room getting reloaded. I'm reloaded, like the Matrix, I'm reloaded. Okay, so the question I have for you, Douglas, is simple. You know, we have this religiosity in the United States that think that we have, quote-unquote, freedom religion. Freedom of belief, freedom of status, of ideology, blah, 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 blah. Why do we keep expressing the same damn propaganda to everyone, and then we spread the ideology to the rest of the world? I mean, I know it's off the topic, but why do we try to spread this ideology? I mean, we're not getting the tax money off of it. Basically, it's a business, you know what I mean?
It's really, I'm gonna butt in first. I think it's completely religious dogma that these people are so brainwashed, because
Jim Jones.
The reason my people left Europe was because we had gone through kings that were Roman Catholic who were killing Protestants. We had kings who were Protestants who were killing Roman Catholics. We had Puritans come up and start killing everybody else. And so we had gone through 300 years of religious persecution. And in the meantime, anyone who had psychic abilities or who pissed off anybody was declared to be a witch and burned at the stake.
Sounds
you
like my
had
family.
people that had not done a fucking thing wrong that were being burned at the stake because somebody else wanted their land.
Hold on.
Now, I see this shit going on whenever that they start talking about taking stuff because you're dealing drugs. I see this people talking about whatever crime of the day it is, just accuse them and put them in jail and take their stuff. This is what immediately comes to mind because it happened to my family. You're falsely accused, you lose everything, and you escape with your life. If you're lucky. If you're not, you're burned at the stake or whatever nasty treatment that they give you at the time. Now, I'll let Douglas take it from there.
I'm sure you covered it really. Maybe some other time, but I think that like Darryl said, it's a fact, but it also takes us from the topic.
Yes, it does.
But my point being that whatever we say about Christianity, which of course there's arguments for separation of church and state that are brought up by some nihilistic movements today that are exploiting Satanism, and they're not Satanist. Whenever you see those Baphomet statues rise up in front of courthouses, it's not Satanists that are putting them up there. This is some this is
atheists.
Yes,
thank you. Oh my God, me and Douglas agreed. Oh, Douglas, me and you just agreed on that.
Yes.
Oh my God.
But I mean, this is what they themselves say.
They're not Satanists. They're atheists that are using that as an in-your-face way of telling the Christians we're supposed to have separation of church and state. That if you're going to push your aggressive dogma, that we're going to push back.
Can I ask you a question, Douglas? Douglas, real quick. I got to ask you a real question. Would a real God or real Savior or whatever institute dogma?
In terms of that, it's that now you're getting philosophical. I think it's too nuanced to pursue right now. It's one of those things that it's not necessarily even constructive, really,
because
in terms of a pursuit. But I appreciate your asking.
Yeah, because it's interesting that people say, well, it's dogma, and the ideology behind dogma is it's based on something, but as we all rub our noses and start to think about it, dogma is man-made.
Having worked in security enforcement and the military contracts, or rather mercenary contracts of a military nature, and using communicators a lot, you get used to using the transceivers that we used to use back in the old days. And the transceivers are the transmitter receivers. And what we used to say is that when somebody overrides somebody else on the transceiver, it's called stepping on them. And so we all have that God part of the brain, which atheists will argue is what causes the delusion of God, or the God delusion. So when it comes to the somebody who's atheistic, they simply have that turned off. It is simply, in their case, their God part of the brain or whatever causes the God delusion is either atrophied or residual or vestigial or malfunctioning. And those who are fanatics, the Taliban or evangelicals, these are people who are stepping on the
I'm
mic.
dying.
They can't hear God because they're doing all the talking. Okay, does that make sense?
Douglas, I can't. Look,
I'm sitting here. I can't talk.
If anybody, no one can beat that.
For those of you who don't know, he's going into paroxysms of orgasmic ecstasy or outrage. We can't tell which.
Douglas, let me say something. People, you need to re-listen to what he just said, because what he just said was more important than waking up in the morning and getting a cup of coffee. Hold on, sorry. No, it ain't. It's more important than using the bathroom.
No, nothing compares to that first cup of coffee.
No, that cup of coffee is heaven. All right, what he just said would just smack the crap out of Santa Claus. What he just said was so much truth that if you listen to what he just said and what he just drove you down a line on, because, you know, Douglas, he talks in circles within circles, but then he hits you with a point, and then he goes back out with the circle. Everybody should know that.
I keep trying to get him to be a little more linear.
You'll never get that.
So that some of the folks in the audience might actually understand what he's saying.
Listen, people, if you're dumb, stupid, or retarded, and you didn't get this information from the beginning, you need to re-listen to this show multiple times. Because what I'm going to say it again. What Douglas just said would smite the crap out of Santa Claus, and the Pope would be sitting down in your bedroom, and you'll look at him like he was just stole your money. So you just need to listen to what he just said to add up, to understand, because this man knows the truth.
I want you to think about something. What he just said about the God part of your brain, you've got folks in the military who are actively working on getting a vaccine to remove that gene that allows that.
Yes, and that's the truth. Hey, I'm out of this. I'm bouncing up, Penny. I just had that important question. You know why? Because me and my mother was just talking, because she's listening to the show, and she goes, you know, you got all the beliefs and everybody listening to this, and it's Halloween, and this, what he's saying is terrifying, my mom said, in more ways than one, because she's...
It is if you stop and think. We've got a lot of people that this is just entertainment. It floats over the top of their head while they're listening or doing whatever it is they're doing. And then we've got some people, maybe 5-10% of them, who are actually listening to what we're saying.
The true story.
Those people are sitting there going, fuck.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Why do you think they cursing so much on this show? Because this shit is real. Now, like I said again, I want you to go back. I don't care who's what, Facebook, YouTube, whatever the hell it is you're on. Go back and listen. Because I know you missed something because you thought you were all smart. Go back and listen and try to understand that there are issues out there in this world that are bigger than you waking up in the morning trying to figure out if you need Folgers or Maxwell House. There are issues out there that are destroying not only the human themselves, but the issues are bigger than you worrying about your issues. If these things are happening out there, I wouldn't even say, Penny, I love my Douglas Dietrich, my 3D man. Like I said, 3D. Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, 3D. Okay, that's all I gotta say. I gotta talk to Jeffrey Daughtry right now. Douglas, I want to see you on his show. Penny, you know what time it is. Hold on, let me give these people some proof right quick. Hold on a second. Let me plug this in right quick. Jeffrey Daughtry, are you there, brother? You're a little low. Hold on. Let me get this right here. I'm on the Penny Bradley show right now. And Douglas Dwayne Dietrich and Penny Bradley, I got to have them both Well, you already had Penny. You got to get Douglas Dwayne Dietrich on your show, bro, because this man is talking 3D, how you get exercise by society type shit. This man is MK Ultra.
I've been after him for years.
Well, guess what, Douglas? Hold on. Let me get the thing in the ear and put this thing. He's been after you for years. Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, do you accept to go on Jeffrey Dahmer's show?
Yes.
He said yes. Hold on, let me get the speaker down here. He said yes. So guess what? We're going to have a big date of people talking reality live on the Global Light Radio Network, live on the Jeffrey Dahmer Show, because you know we are late night in the heartland when it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer.
Thank you so much.
All right, so Douglas will get in touch with you this as soon as he gets off this show, and we're going to get this rolling. Penny?
We could schedule it now. When's his next available?
Oh no, I'm off for now. Let me talk to my man. let me talk to Jeffrey, because he's ready to go for you. Because guess what? We're bringing Douglas back, god damn it. We're going to make him the household name that he was, because you motherfuckers out there trying to destroy that man. And you know something? If you walk with Jesus, you walk with Islam or whatever the hell, Mohammed, you know something? Let me give you a little example of something. I ain't playing no more. I don't care who you walk with, but you better walk with the truth. And the truth is going to set you free. Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, you go back with Penny. I'm talking to Jeffrey, and we're going to set the world free. Because we're going to unindoctrinate these people of all their goddamn lies. Douglas is all yours.
Okay, thank you. And
Your turn.
So thank you, Penny. And so we'll go on while he takes care of that. And in the meantime, honey, let me see if I can. How come I'm not seeing your face, darling? Say something. Maybe your face will come back on screen.
I
There we
should
are.
be. Oh, you
There we
see
are.
me. Okay.
Yes, there.
Because I've just been seeing you and Daryl, or
Yeah,
actually
it's
your
odd.
symbol and Daryl.
Right.
So.
Right, and again, that's the online broadcasting software symbol.
Yeah, that's Skype. We're not going to worry about it. It is what it is. We were going to experiment with just doing audio on the radio network itself, and just keeping the video portion on my YouTube. So
Well, I hope the photograph of you does stay up there with your address as it is now. Wonderful, and that's delightful. So to finish my point, this couple has just been let out of jail in Texas against the protestations of their former victims, and for the first time, one of these precedents in legal history, a judge can only declare you guilty or not guilty. No one is considered innocent because we do have a Christian background in America, and our laws are based on biblical or Mosaic laws. So the concept of Christians is that, no one is innocent because all men and women are born with original sin. That was very much a Christian concept. So this is one of the reasons why judges do not declare innocence in court. It would put them on the level of God. That is, and also to say someone is innocent puts you on a level of divinity, because it would mean like you were the Virgin Mary or the Jesus child or something.
I tend to go more with what the Jews teach, that we're born clean and fuck ourselves up after that.
Understood. Yeah, I'm not advocating this perspective of original sin, mind you, but in terms of American law, which is rooted in that biblical and Mosaic law, the judge declared this couple of satanic pedophiles innocent. In other words, they were legally declared to be divine. To declare someone innocent is like saying you're the Christ child. It's like saying you're divine and that you're worthy of worship. So Francis and Dan Keller are now gods in America for all intents and purposes. And they were given millions and millions of dollars. So, honestly, the idea that if I would gladly have taken that bargain, I would spend 21 and a half years in jail easy for millions and millions of dollars, even if it's only like 4 or 5 million, because most of you will work that amount of time in your lives and you won't have anything to show for it. You'll have absolutely nothing. You'll simply...
if they would leave me alone in the cell and let me read, I might be okay with that.
Yeah, I hear you there too. It's that, it's at that level. But here we are. That's an example of what's going on now. And what these people are portrayed as are victims. These people are portrayed as victims of the satanic panic. And so if you were to look up satanic ritual abuse, you would not find satanic ritual abuse. The first thing you'll find is a Wikipedia entry on satanic panic. And yeah.
I have friends who are researching and have websites, and they cannot even get in the first 3 pages of these searches because they're telling the truth about what's going on.
Thank you. And so this is the problem that we're dealing with. So in terms of Michael Aquino's impact on the world, and then going back to this, understand that at the time that I was working at the Presidio military base and also producing pornography via the illustration, then at the same time at John O'Connell, where I was using the art studios, even after I had graduated and took the GED, I was familiar with the facility and allowed to use the studios at night. I had the keys, really.
Wow.
And yeah, and one of the things that I knew was that Gary Willard Hambright stored his child pornography on site because he was an ordained Southern Baptist minister, albeit without a pulpit, and he lived in a church and he could not maintain his child pornography at the church. This is not to absolve the church that he lived in, because there's plenty of Baptist child molesters, as he was the personification of, just as there are many Catholics or any other kinds of religions where they're taking advantage of their position, taking advantage of the vulnerable.
When I looked into it 2012, 2013, it was every faith or position where adult men or women had access to children they were trusted with. So it was all genders, all faiths. It was the position of being trusted with a child was what was the issue. So apparently we're not supposed to trust our children with anybody.
Thank you. And so when it came to Gary Willard Hambright, that was how I got him busted. He maintained his child porn collection, which was extensive, as quote unquote art references, because of course anybody who illustrates, anybody who was a professional illustrator would tell you there are many nude references, even of children, so that people can produce illustrations based on the human body. So this was his excuse. Of course, they're not just pictures of nude children posing in Michelangelo-esque poses. These are having sex with dogs and each other, and various implements being inserted within them, etc. So the way we got him busted was the fact that he was maintaining child porn on SFUSD, or San Francisco Unified School District property. But that's how the city and county of San Francisco busted him. It was not the federal government on site, the Presidio military base, where he was also one of the managers at the child daycare center. So that was going on. And at the same time, while I was working at the library and illustrating, it came to my attention that Iraq was in a very long war with Iran, and they were going to basically provide payment and pay the transportation and lodgings for anyone who would work for them in a propaganda campaign. They were looking for foreign talent that could explain their situation to the outside world. And so what happened was that I volunteered.
That was the war where Saddam Hussein was using a chemical agent called yellow rain on the Iranians.
Yeah, and yes, the Iranians was the yellow rain, the cyclosaurine nerve gas was on the Kurds, and ultimately, you know, the Marines on the front lines. John Warrington was informing myself. He's the man who rescued all of my archives. So, of course, his word matters. He says he got cut off after saying the bottom line is, okay, so he was talking about something got cut off or glitched for a while, but apparently we're still transmitting. So just reporting. Hopefully everybody can report to us about how our audio is, and hopefully it's going well. And when it comes to why I bring this up, when I was brought to Iraq in the what turned out to be one of the closing years, the closing year of the conflict between Iran and Iraq, the Iraqi army had seen 8 years, almost a decade of combat. And when I, as a propagandist, somebody who was going to produce propaganda art and posters for the Saddam Hussein regime, I never met Saddam Hussein. For people who are curious about that, I get asked that a lot. But when I was brought to the front lines and given a tour, I personally saw the Iraqi army using machine guns to mow down the enemy. And the enemy, because at that point in history, the Iranians had lost so many adult men, they had to basically preserve their numbers of adult men by using children. So they would take young boys, give them little plastic keys, and tell them these were their keys to heaven. And they would chain them together, and they would, at bayonet point, march them forward so that they would trigger all the landmines. That way the kids would take the brunt of the punishment, and the adult males could survive to reach the front lines and engage the Iraqis. So the Iraqis had been engaging this obviously ruthless enemy. And I personally saw children being blown up crossing those minefields so that the adults could get to bayonet point with the Iraqis on our lines. And this army was not the kind of army to panic. So when Michael Aquino was engaging in this ritual to call forth the anti-gods on the fields of Babylon in the days of the Gulf War that happened later, one of the things I can tell you is that as a Marine, we took in many prisoners. And these prisoners who surrendered were all saying, Al Cthulhu, Al Cthulhu. They said that they had seen Cthulhu arise out of the ground. And this was a vision that Aquino essentially was generating with his spell casting. He was calling forth on the anti-gods. And for those of you who do not know, Al Cthulhu is the Islamic word for the abandoner, the great abandoner, that which is worse than Satan. But what?
He's one of the old gods.
Yes, thank you. And so in terms of Michael Aquino, this was an impact that he had on the world. Another impact was that throughout the Cold War, he had been given orders to, of course, do what he could for his country to try and dismantle the Soviet Union. And his contacts were with the Russian resistance, which at that point in history under the Soviet Union was basically of the Rasputin tradition. We are speaking of Satanists. And many of these were Michael Aquino's co-religionists. So one of them was Alexander Dugin. And Alexander Dugin was proudly introduced multiple times by Alex Jones on his own program as Putin's brain. So Alexander Dugin is a co-religionist of Michael Aquino, known to be involved with the Temple of Set. And ultimately, this is the what rules Russia today. We're under a Rasputin type of satanic government in the former Soviet Union. This was what rose to replace Boris Yeltsin and cast an infernal satanic order over the Russian people, who are suffering terribly and dying in droves due to COVID. We have a situation now where this is one of the legacies of Michael Aquino. His work with Satanists behind the Iron Curtain led us to where we are today with a revanchist, revisionist Russia. So this man has done incredible damage to the world around him. The destruction of the Iraqi army, which was one of the most professional, one of the largest armies in the world, one of the most professional in the world, the destruction of them and then consequently their country, that has done no good for the world and produced ISIS and the Taliban. Yes, it was Al Qaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban were all given a terrorist domicile by the ruins of Iraq, a playground in which they could practice their terrorism. We are in a situation now where if we go back to the horrors he committed back then, what I can do, aside from recommending that everybody also listen to Salman Sheikh's interview with myself, but yesterday, because he'll also be interviewing Penny Bradley very soon. We have
I believe it's the 9th or the 10th.
Yeah.
It will be after I come back from the conference.
Fabulous. So what I can do right now is reference people to that for some details about other aspects of the horror. But one thing that I can tell you is that the satanic so-called panic is quite real. It is not something that is fictitious. And I'll give you an example. When it comes to the Dozier dig, for instance, in Dozier, Florida, Dozier. People can look up the Dozier dig in Florida, and hopefully you will be appalled. You should be, because that was the home of the White House Boys. And if you look up the graves at Dozier, this is a place in Florida where you had boys who were sent to a kind of juvenile delinquency center to be rehabilitated. And hundreds of them died. They're buried in shallow graves in Dozier. But you'll find out that the book that's written about them is titled The White House Boys. And they're called the White House Boys because many of them were brought to service America's elite within the White House. And when those who refused to do so were punished, most of them died in punishment. So they were buried in shallow graves that are just so shallow that if you take a look at the Dozier dig, you'd be appalled at the shallowness of the graves. We're talking about like 2 feet into the ground or something like that. It's like people were so lazy they weren't even bothering to go any deeper when they buried them.
That's not deep enough. They would end up with a stench that would give the whole place away.
You would think. Now, granted, if you take a look at the photographs, it's probably about 3 feet because there's a major dig and then the shallow graves are within the dig, but it can't be that deep. It looks very shallow.
That was the whole point of 4 to 6 feet, was because of the stench.
Nobody cared about the stench, honey. If you take a look at those old Madeline laundries in Ireland, nobody was like doing any work to really. They felt they could act with impunity because they did. They acted with impunity. The Madeline laundries.
Yes. The Madeline laundries were pretty bad.
Yeah.
Some of the folks in Middle America just took advantage of septic tanks.
Yeah, well, that's what you found at the Madeline laundries. At the Madeline laundries, they found hundreds of bones in the septic tanks of human children, like what amounted to hundreds and hundreds of children. Their bones filled the septic tanks. But in the Dozier dig, I don't think anybody worried about the stench because nobody was coming to check. Nobody cared. And that's the problem that we're dealing with, is that everybody goes into denial and attacks the victim. This is what I went to heavily with Salman Sheikh. It's the victims who are attacked. And
I noticed that the last major legal situation regarding pedophilia was the one in Omaha, Nebraska, that involved Boys Town, and they were sending young boys from that orphanage to the White House to service the elite, and this was during a Republican administration. So I know the Republicans are all blaming the Democrats right now, but at the time it was a Republican administration. And the only people who actually did prison time were the witnesses that testified in court.
Thank you. Yes. And this is the kind
that's been a common problem throughout our entire history, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. Any time that you get witnesses, it's the witnesses that go to prison. It's not the perps.
Yes, that this is true. And this is why we are in such a state where none of the witnesses will talk. And yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. And you don't blame them. Yes.
You can't blame them because they end up victimized not just by the perps, but by the court system and by the media.
Right. And certainly one of the things that helped Michael Aquino out and all of these child trafficking rings is the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. I delved into that with to a great degree with our man Salman Sheikh, but I'll go into it a bit here. They're a prominent group that promotes the idea that children who claim they've been abused in satanic rituals all have wild imaginations, or they were prodded along by zealot psychologists, and they've been completely successful in their mission. You've got examples of, say, for instance, when I go online and I try to look up anything concerning satanic ritual abuse, instead you get the opposite. You'll get satanic panic propaganda all the way. There was a Reddit post I saw that was promoting the false memory theory that received over 2,000 upvotes. And the members of the FMSF, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, they were called to appear as expert witnesses in dozens of court cases. Now, the one thing that...
But what's interesting is when you start interacting with folks with dissociative identity disorder, the most common means of producing alters in children is sexual abuse. And you can't find that when you're looking for SRA, but you can when you're looking for DID.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you have to be careful about your search terms.
Yes, there we are. Search tip, people. Now, in terms of one thing that I've already established is that there's been hundreds of different children reporting satanic abuse, not only across the country, but in different continents as well. And that alone is enough to make the false memory theory very flimsy. But in terms of the FMSF itself, the overwhelming majority of the members are pedophiles. They're not just people who have been accused of pedophilia by their own children, but they're also part of the military industrial complex. One of the primary founders, Peter J. Freyd, F-R-E-Y-D, he founded the FMSF because his own daughter, who herself is a psychologist, testified that he had sexually assaulted her throughout her childhood. And so his response was to found a national institute so he could discredit her and everyone like her. David Dinges, D-I-N-G-E-S, a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the FMSF, was involved with naval intelligence. Harold Leaf, surnamed L-E-I-F, was involved with CIA mind control experiments. Paul McHugh was a very vocal critic of dissociative identity disorder, and he worked at military hospitals. Martin T. Orne, surname O-R-N-E, was funded.
Well, that's interesting because I have spoken to retired officers who have sent me friend requests, and I've checked and made sure they were the real people instead of some pretender. And when I introduced myself, I asked them, do you know what a dissociative is? And they go, yeah. I go, well, I am one. And they go, that's above my pay grade.
Okay.
So the military is perfectly aware of folks like me.
There we are. Thank you. Thank you. And the Martin T. Orne character I mentioned, he was funded by MK Ultra Harvard Crimson. That was the name of their operation. And finally, there was this Ralph Underwager character affiliated with their organization who's claimed it was God's will when adults engage in sex with children. Honestly, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Pardon me, folks, but those people should be tied to a wall and you know how they used to do these crashes with cars with test dummies? They should be the victims of the crash cars. This is what they deserve.
Thank you. Thank you. As a matter of fact,
I'm sorry if that offends people, but I have been one of their victims, and this is My sincere feelings on the matter is that they should be test crash dummies.
Thank you. Except that's too merciful. But just so look, here's the Columbia Journalism Review. I've got this up on my screen. Just a single paragraph here should suffice so people understand about the FS, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, FMSF. Basically, what the Columbia Journalism Review says is rarely has such a strange and little understood organization had such a profound effect on media coverage of such a controversial matter. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation is an aggressive, well-financed PR machine adept at manipulating the press, harassing its critics, and mobilizing a diverse army of psychiatrists, outspoken academics, expert defense witnesses, litigious attorneys, Freud bashers, critics of psychotherapy, and devastated parents. So with that as context, think about what happened at the McMartin preschool abuse scandal. Now, what's interesting is that whenever I bring up the Presidio, a lot of people will bring up Ted Gunderson, this FBI guy, who, of course, is, in my opinion, I really am ambivalent about him, but I'm leaning towards the negative. As a matter of fact, I never saw him anywhere at the Presidio military base investigation. In all the years I was involved, Ted Gunderson had nothing to do with it, yet he certainly grabbed a lot of credit wherever he could. But he was involved, I know this for a fact, with the McMartin preschool abuse scandal. And when he was investigating that, well, that's located in California. It was the center of a massive child prostitution and pornography ring, and it was the center of an equally massive cover-up. And all the concerns began in August of '83 when a mother told police that her 2-year-old son had been sexually abused. And by 1984, 1 year later, we're talking about at the time that I had already taken my GED to get out of John O'Connell. At that point in time, 360 children had come forward claiming abuse, and they all had physical evidence of it, describing wild satanic rituals.
The physical evidence should have overridden all of the nonsense.
Thank you. And of course, they all spoke of being transported in underground tunnels. This is where I get the doubt with Ted Gunderson. If he had truly been following up on this, truly been investigating this, he could have found out about those tunnels because, according to Michael Aquino himself, some of them ultimately led to the Presidio military base. So the mainstream media did their best to discredit these tunnels, but the parents employed an archaeologist, and the archaeologist used scalar technology, which is used to find...
That just impresses the hell out of me that the parents did that.
Thank you. The archaeologist's name was E. Gary Stickle. And so this...
I've heard that name.
Yes.
I can't place where, but I've heard that name.
Edwin Gary Stickle. And Edwin Gary Stickle used ground-penetrating radar and proved that the ground was riddled with tunnels under McMartin. And they were so long, he had no idea where they ultimately led, though some of them were south of the border. And remember what they said about those kids being taken south of the border and raped by Mexican troops. So this is, he conducted a survey in 1990 after the property had been sold, and it was long after the charges against the abuse perpetrators had been dropped, and all the victims were thoroughly marginalized in the mainstream media with help from the Foundation for False Memory Syndrome. And he found at least 2 extensive tunnel systems under the preschool, which accurately reflected the testimonies given by the children down to the inch. So basically, in summation, the media and your government would have us all believe that 360 children all invented false memories of horrific satanic abuse, of participating in rituals in which to all the adults sheathed in black ceremonial robes uttered chants, that they all lied about being transported for prostitution across town, and that they all lied about being photographed and videotaped for child pornography, despite verification of emotional and physical abuse, and the evidence of tunnels under the complex. All of them were marginalized in the press. The FBI denied any legitimate claims. The prosecution harassed the victims endlessly in court, and all charges, of course, were eventually dropped. So we have a situation in which, of course, no one reports this anymore for those very reasons. And ultimately, nobody treats these cases because those psychiatrists and counselors or psychologists as well, or even social workers who try to help these people in any way, they're persecuted themselves, and they're told that they're conducting malpractice, that they're encouraging the delusion. So there's no way to seek treatment for these abuses. This is part of the horror of our society. And
as an adult who has survived all of that crap as a child, I still have alters. I have PTSD. And when I have to change doctors, they usually go through a phase where they want to put me on meds, and I just tell them no. And the last one I told her no, she screamed at me that I had the worst PTSD she had ever seen, and did I know that that meant I was mentally ill? Well, number one, I'm in my 60s. Yeah, I know I have PTSD. That's the least of my problems. Does that mean I'm mentally ill just because I disturb people around me? Well, so does my neighbor that's a bully. Does that mean that he should be on meds? Come on.
thank you.
I think overall that I fit in pretty decently for what's happened to me in the past. But they don't want to ever hear anything. It's like, well, you have PTSD, but we don't want you to talk about it. We just want you to be magically well again. I'm sorry, it ain't gonna happen.
Talk about a magical thought process.
You either deal with me the way I am, or you step aside and let me find somebody that will.
Thank you. And so what Penny had been referring to earlier was, of course, the what became known as the Lincoln, Nebraska scandal. And it happened simultaneously to a kind of bank scandal that was going on at the same time. And so it's very confusing. But basically, you've got child abuse and pedophile rings that the United States has perhaps the largest child trafficking epidemic in the world. And the FBI, in case you didn't know, I'm sorry, honey.
I've been tracked. One of the things that Anonymous was covering a decade ago was the child abuse, pedophilia throughout the free world, as in not behind the Chinese firewall. So they had been tracking this, and there are still hashtags on Twitter where that you can find their links to paste bin sites where that they have their evidence documented.
Yeah.
And so these groups of hackers who are consistently discredited as being weirdos, where have we heard that before? That these people are crazy or untrustworthy or demonic or whatever because they're exposing criminal behavior?
Yes. Thank you.
So, yeah, if you really want to look into the crimes, and here again, the folks who have documented the crimes have ended up doing more jail time than the perps they exposed.
Thank you. Thank you.
That has been the one consistency through this entire topic, is the victims and witnesses are the ones who are punished.
Yes, very important. And important to note, of course, that the FBI, in case you didn't know it, does not track statistics for missing children.
No,
The
they don't.
people who do that are a private organization known as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They're
That's right.
private. They have nothing to do with your federal government. And so the FBI, of all the statistics it keeps tabs on, rape, homicide, domestic abuse, what amounts to perhaps the single most important one in terms of citizen safety is ominously missing. And
they also do not track murders by police.
thank you, that too. But
So
that's almost a given.
Between the two of them, they are not tracking murders by police. They are not tracking missing or exploited children.
Thank you. But the police is almost expected. You would expect the law enforcement agents to close ranks around themselves. You'd expect them to at least protect the future of their fucking nation. At any rate, they simply don't want us to know how bad the epidemic is. And of course, it should be noted that FBI prosecution of major child trafficking rings has been virtually non-existent. So when it comes to what Penny was referring to, what happened was that on June 29th of 1989, there was a headline that came out with basically documents revealed by the Washington Times reveals that a homosexual prostitution ring is under investigation by federal and district authorities and includes among its clients key officials of the Reagan and Bush administrations, military officers, congressional aides, and U.S. and foreign businessmen with close ties to Washington's political elites. So
this was the same time frame that you were shutting down the Presidio.
Yes, thank you. And this was all ongoing, which is why there's this individual named David Schroeder, who I bring up because I respect his victimhood. He is a victim of Michael Aquino. Of course, he hates my guts. And as I pointed out with Salman Sheikh, it's one of those things where as soon as I entered the scene, apparently Michael Aquino, who had been abusing him very thoroughly, lost interest in him. So he hates me because he's jealous that I got Michael Aquino's attention. You'd think he'd thank me for relieving him of those kinds of attentions, but victims develop Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome. Yeah, that was immediately what was going to pop out of my mouth.
Yeah.
They do. They get attached to their abusers because in the short term, that's the only way you can survive. In the long term, it makes you one really sick puppy.
Well, James Casbolt / Michael Prince, who's as sick as a puppy can get, he was constantly writing Aquino publicly. Whenever Aquino would pop up and wade into YouTube diatribes in the thread to basically say something like, I don't know, Douglas Dietrich, or whatever else he'd say, then James Casbolt / Michael Prince would show up demanding that Michael Aquino turn himself in for care provision by James Casbolt / Michael Prince. He wanted to become Michael Aquino's care provider. So there's some Stockholm syndrome for you. That was turn yourself into my.
I'm glad you can laugh about that because that one is disturbing as hell.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, he had to be institutionalized for a reason. They've released him, but I don't know if the family he victimized, the Mayer family, I don't know if they were able to get him back in prison again or what, or institutionalized. Yeah, it's but at any rate,
I don't know his current situation,
understood.
but he has not appeared in my community, so. My community is the one that he likes to be a part of. So.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. Then always. So all of this was going down at the time of the Presidio military base, and this is, of course, you're talking about the military daycare center. When I exposed the activities going down there, it was around 1987. And it took years and years for results. But yeah, basically, thank you. And we're not talking about abuse involving just children. We're talking about abuse involving infants. And so understand that at that point that I exposed what was going on in the Presidio, I exposed all that was going on at military daycare centers across the country. And this was 30 different military daycare centers. And the reason at that point, what I exposed was the fact that this abuse had been going on for 3 years that I was aware of it. So we're talking about this period of time, all the while that I was working as a librarian's aide, becoming a military reference technician. And of course, this included some of the most esteemed bases, such as West Point and Fort Dix, DIX. So honestly, basically all of the stories were horrifyingly familiar. And at the Presidio military base, I instantly recognized the symptoms in many of the children who were coming in and needed help to the bathroom because they couldn't move, because they were in so much pain, because they had been so violated. When they came in and asked for help, I saw instantly they had symptoms of chlamydia. And of course, all of them showed clear signs of abuse. So in terms of the victims, we're talking about people who were aged 3 and 4 who were able to express themselves about what was going on. And of course, it took a year for them to close the daycare center after I exposed all of this. And of course, the only charges that were brought against any man was initially one man, Gary Willard Hambright. By the way, did you just send me a video?
No.
Oh, I got a notification saying Penny Bradley video or something. Okay, so you know, God knows what's going on with that. I'll ignore that. And
news. I was having a coughing episode, so I turned off my mic for a minute.
Okay, that
rather,
didn't cause that.
Rather than interrupt you. So
thank you. Oh no, definitely appreciate it. And so in terms of Michael Aquino, as I said, when it came to him, of course, he was basically no charges were ever brought against him that held. But it's important to note that when he sued the U.S. Army to have his name taken off the suspects list, the CID, the Criminal Investigations Department, they refused to take his name off the suspects list. And that was because it was a means of controlling him. It was a means of keeping him under some form of control. But let me tell you this, what most people are unaware of is that the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, and that's spelled ortho like orthopedics, O-R-T-H-O, and then psychiatry, all one word. The American Journal of Orthopsychiatry wrote an extensive analysis of the victims of the Presidio. And what they stated was the severity of the trauma for children at the Presidio was immediately manifest in clear-cut symptoms. Before the abuse was exposed, parents had already noticed the following changes in their children: vaginal discharge, genital soreness, rashes, fear of the dark, sleep disturbances, nightmares, sexually provocative language, and sexually inappropriate behavior. In addition, the children were exhibiting other radical changes in behavior, including temper outbursts, sudden mood shifts, and poor impulse control. All these behavioral symptoms are to be expected in preschool children who have been molested. There we have that. I mean, this was damning.
That was damning, yeah.
And
so, why weren't they taken seriously?
Well, what happened ultimately was the California decided that no childhood testimony can ever be taken seriously. This gave pedophiles a 007 license to kill. And in fact, childhood testimony is not allowed in court in the state of California after what I exposed. So California went to bat for the pedophiles. This is one reason why the radicalized right thinks that California is so crazy. In this case, they're right.
They are sometimes.
Yeah, and in terms of the Aquino and his appearance on different television shows, that's well remembered, and we've gone into that before. And it was on the autumnal equinox of 1987 that that was an occult day of great importance, that the fire was struck that burned down the building adjacent to the daycare center, which destroyed all of the records relating to the daycare center. And a month later, another fire would be set that destroyed the daycare center itself. Now, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau, the BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, of course, they know a lot about fire. They burned Waco down. Well, they were brought in to investigate, and they concluded that the causes of both fires was arson. But of course, the U.S. Army cried jurisdiction and said, well, you're a federal branch of investigation, but well, this is our headquarters of the United States Sixth Army. This is Army property, and we call jurisdiction, and we say that it's faulty wiring. Of course, that's all bullshit. The prosecution, of course, when they brought the charges against Gary Willard Hambright, even though he was indicted by a federal grand jury for assaults on children, one thing that was interesting was that throughout his trial, the prosecutors never included the allegations of children with seriously documented abuse, such as missing hymens and rectal lesions. The children were chosen on the basis of who would make the best witnesses, and yet the guy still lost in court because the jury could just see that it was all so obvious. But he was the scapegoat, the man thrown under the bus, rightly crucified, but nevertheless never served a day in jail because he died first of AIDS. And after that, they transferred all of the families out of Presidio to all of their bases scattered all over the rest of the world. Understand that on any given day, and this is back in the 1980s and into the 90s, the United States had bases in Germany, places they were leasing in Japan, bases on Okinawa, bases in South Korea, Panama. They transferred these families to hell and gone all over the world. And understand that all these places had daycare centers of their own. Wherever the Army is, there are daycare centers. The Army on any given day when I was working with them was caring for 100,000 children a day on a daily basis. So we're talking about if you want to know what a major human trafficking ring looks like that's operating on a worldwide scale, you can look at the U.S. military. That's it. So, honey, this is some example of the horrors that we're dealing with. And Michael Aquino, of course, was in the center of it all. And in terms of his own career, he believed himself, or rather presented a belief of himself as the victim of a Christian conspiracy. So we're talking about Michael Aquino himself, the Mengele of the West Coast, as many of his victims call him. We're talking about a psychological warfare specialist in the U.S. Army who served from 1968 until 1990, when he was involuntarily discharged as a result of the investigations into his involvement in the ritual sexual abuse of children at the Presidio Daycare Center in San Francisco. And throughout that time, he was an openly practicing devout Satanist. And he joined Anton LaVey's Church of Satan circa 1968. And in 1975 is when he established his own Temple of Set, which has been in operation ever since, even past his point of death. So when it came to his psyops, they involved using many levels of deception and coercion to manipulate the perceptions of others for ulterior motives. So those were the skills Aquino was the most familiar with, very comfortable in using. And he was an expert in propaganda, skilled in techniques for disseminating misinformation and disinformation, and using misdirection and confusion tactics and isolation techniques and revisionism. And so he's used all those skills all his life to defend himself against the truth of his actions. So he would assert that his name kept coming up in the pedophile ring cases because he was the victim of a conspiracy. He would say that it was a black bag job.
Remember what I said about conspiracies? 90% of them are actually based in reality.
Yes, yes. And he would say that people hated him just because he's a Satanist. And understand, of course, that he doesn't seem to say that, well, that's your choice in lifestyle, right? That's he doesn't seem to take responsibility.
When you stand for something that is against what most people in your community, you know, it's like you're bucking the system, and you don't expect anybody to get upset.
Yes, yes.
Come on.
There we are. There we are. And, you know, since he's really actually inviting the allegations by such a stance, he really shouldn't complain about it. But he keeps his perceptions of all that bad publicity. He always kept it focused strictly on the Presidio child abuse case, in which he was, of course, the central figure, thanks to my expositions. And that's the only one he's ever had to legally defend himself against. So that was important. But even in that isolated case, he wrote an entire book. And like Peter Moon said, it's mostly a collection of foot bullets. But he was, in other words, he was incriminating himself even by producing the publication. But even in that isolated case of the Presidio, Aquino only dared focus on it as far as his own limited version of the facts went. He totally avoided acknowledging the larger body of evidence that always implicated him personally. And equally, he totally overlooked the longer history of events he was implicated in by various sources who were far removed from one another and who couldn't possibly be engaged in any sort of conspiracy against him. So in terms of putting everything into perspective, you're really going into almost kind of a resume, really. It's something that, well, back in 1967, remember, I had just been 1 year old. I was still in Taiwan. I was born in 66, in October of 66. I was 1 year old in Taiwan. Michael Aquino had begun a 2-year tour of duty in Vietnam. He took part in the infamous Phoenix program, which was an assassination, torture, and terror operation initiated by the CIA with the aim of neutralizing the civilian infrastructure that supported the Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam. It was called a final solution, and it blatantly violated all the Geneva Conventions.
Where have we heard that term before?
Yes, thank you. Well, the targets for assassination included Viet Cong tax collectors, supply officers, political cadre, local military officers, suspected sympathizers. But even he and anyone involved would admit that faulty intelligence, as they called it, more often led to, well, the killing of innocent civilians. The murder of innocent civilians included young children. And oftentimes orders were given to kill U.S. military personnel who were considered security risks. In 1971, William Colby, the head of the CIA in Vietnam at the time, he later testified that the number of people killed was at least 21,000, while the South Vietnamese government figures were 50,000 dead. So you had this murderous PSYOP program that had the effect of creating legions of cold-blooded psychopathic killers who then returned home to the United States of America as completely different people than when they left. And they all, by Aquino's own testimony, were converted to Satanism after their involvement in the Phoenix program. Michael Aquino was there to lead them. This was part of his private army of serial killers in the United States that he could turn against anyone. And whenever, just immediately as soon after these killers started coming home,
Um,
there began this steady rise in horrific serial murders with satanic undertones that centered around the Southern California area where Michael Aquino often lived, which, of course, Penny Bradley can attest to. I'm sure you remember all that.
oh yeah. The media at the time was absolutely filled with serial killers. And it was almost like the serial killers were designed to take attention away from the pedophile cases.
And yes, and in 1980, now
Um,
according, yeah,
Now I'm gonna say something here. My first child was born in '76, and I was living in Southern California during this. And a lot of this media attention just absolutely terrified me at the time.
thank you. This was true terrorism. This was terrorism.
And I had a serious problem because I was trying to finish my degree, which I never was able to, and I was trying to work and support these kids that I had and pay for childcare, and I ended up with people that may not have been the smartest, may have been more religious than they should have been, but at least they were not fucking my kids.
Yes, and cannibalizing you.
Yeah.
So around 1980, according to sworn testimony given before a U.S. Senate in later years, the MK Ultra mind control victim Kathy O'Brien claimed she was programmed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky in 1980 by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino of the United States Army. And she testified
I remember her.
Yes, thank you. She testified that Aquino used barbaric trauma techniques on both her daughter Kelly and herself that involved NASA technology. And that's very important. These space program kids were just being touched upon then. And Kathy O'Brien claimed that she was a presidential model monarch sex slave, meaning that she was specially programmed to cater to the sexual perversions of the highest-ranking politicians in the United States. And she stated that during her time as a sex slave, which started as a child, she serviced a number of well-known politicians, including both Bill and Hillary Clinton, Ronald Reagan, Pierre Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, George H.W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and the governors Lamar Alexander and Richard Thornburg, Bill Bennett, Senator Patrick Leahy, the Senator Robert Byrd, who she said was her handler, and Arlen Specter. Now, O'Brien eventually gave testimony before the U.S. Senate regarding the events she was forced to go through, and although she named her perpetrators, not one of them dared to challenge her. And not a single one of them ever sued her for defamation of character or slander. And I think that that's soft evidence right there.
Yeah. One of the things about that time frame that just completely mortifies me is that it's a known fact that Reagan frequented Bohemian Grove.
Yes.
And yet all of these I get so frustrated with the community that thinks Republicans are going to save the world, and they consider Reagan to be a saint, and yet he was at Bohemian Grove regularly, and it was his White House that was accused in the Lincoln, Nebraska scandals.
Absolutely. Him and George Bush Sr. directly after him.
And I'm looking at that. I'm looking at the way that his administration started the destruction of the public school systems, and a lot of the things that happened in his administration are the direct cause of the problems we're having now.
Yeah,
And
like he released,
yet-
he shut down all of the mental health facilities that resulted in all the homeless. So go on.
So yeah, I have had young conservative people scream at me, literally scream at me, because they think he's some sort of a saint.
Well, that's
And
madness. Yeah, I mean, the guy was simply an actor, and he was senile by the time he became president, and George H.W. Bush was running the show
well,
anyway.
he wasn't senile. He was shot and had a stroke while he was shot.
Okay.
So he it wasn't the same thing. It had the same result, but it wasn't actually what they said it was.
Okay.
But he had been basically assassinated, and the body survived, but the person he had been before had not. So yeah, it was Papa Bush and Nancy who were running the country after that.
That's true. That's true. Absolutely. And Nancy was running it on the basis of a lot of astrological advisements. I know that much. Yeah. So
Yeah. So this was a confusing, frustrating, difficult time period at best. And we had all this crap going on. And then I listened to the people who are now in their 20s and 30s, and they're saying, well, that was a wonderful time in history. No, it wasn't.
no, I mean, it was
a destruction.
Yeah.
There, up to that point, there had been attempts to make a more egalitarian, more middle class culture for all of us, and he put a stop to that.
Yes.
And he set the groundwork for NAFTA, which took away the middle class jobs.
Yeah.
So what he did was set up the structure for neo-feudalism.
Yes. Thank you.
And that is the biggest problem we have right now is the neo-feudalism is the destruction of the middle class. So we are going to have very poor people and we are going to have very rich people. And we're watching that happen now.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. No, it's definitely the damage he did was immeasurable. And so it was on September 5th of 1982 that 12-year-old Johnny Gosh, he was abducted. And that was from a shopping mall parking lot in West Des Moines, Iowa. And this was while he was doing his early morning paper route. He was never seen again, but years later, during an interview with Ted Gunderson as a private investigator, then the child abductee and the sex slave victim, Paul Bonacci, revealed that as a child, he was directly involved in Johnny Gosh's abduction. He acted as a lure to draw Gosh into the hands of his pedophile abductors. And according to Bonacci, the abduction was ordered by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who later picked Gosh up at a farmhouse where he was being held at and delivered him to a buyer in Colorado. And for years, both of those boys were used for the pedophiliac pleasures of high-ranking government officials. So in terms of that, one of the things that I found out from the sleazy detective, Ed Opperman, was that he was talking to Johnny Gosh's mother. And Johnny Gosh's mother had ultimately wound up physically intimate with Ted Gunderson. And this was because, they were talking so much about her child and she needed comfort, and he took advantage of that. And she said that in the morning, he would get up, or in the middle of the night, he would get up and receive these calls. And she heard him referencing Michael Aquino specifically. In other words, referring to the man calling him as, "Yes, Colonel Aquino. Yes, sir, Colonel Aquino." And so he was getting orders directly from Michael Aquino. And that's what she found out, was that he was directly involved with the man who had abducted her son. And of course, they severed after that. But that was,
How all these people stay out of prison, I have no idea.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you got one.
And yes, I do have an idea. It's because there's a set of laws for us and a set of laws for them.
There's no laws for them, but a set of laws for us, but none for them.
They pretty much are allowed to do whatever the fuck they want, and we are sitting here sitting ducks for whatever it is they want. And personally, I'm just to the point of Why the common folks tolerate this shit, I have no idea.
Thank you. Yeah, well,
There-
it was in 1985 that the exposure of ritual abuse at the Jubilation Daycare Center at Fort Bragg erupted when several children reported being sexually abused by a number of people at the daycare center and several other locations, including at least 2 churches. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino was identified as having been present at those churches.
Mhm.
And then in November of 1986 is when I hemorrhaged much of what I knew of. That's when I exposed what happened regarding the sexual abuse being perpetrated at the U.S. Army's Presidio Child Development Center in San Francisco. Now, within a year, of course, I had provided all the evidence they needed for 60 of the victims who were identified from the beginning. Hundreds more were then involved after that in providing their testimony. All of these children, just so people understand the gravity of this, they were between the ages of 3 and 7 that were able to talk. Other children were victims who were infants who could not speak of what had been done to them, but their parents knew. Say, for instance, the infant was brought home and its hips were dislocated because the penis inserted in its vagina was so large that it displaced the hips of the infant child. This is what we were dealing with. But the ones that were able to talk told of being taken to private homes to be abused, at least 3 houses aside from what I identified in San Francisco on Leavenworth Street that I had brought up before, that all the children were taken on a drive-by and they were able to point it out. And of course, that's 2430 Leavenworth. Aside from that, 3 other domiciles were positively identified, aside Aquino's. And the children, of course, described being urinated and defecated upon, being forced to ingest urine and feces, and irrefutable medical evidence documented the fact that all of these children were sexually abused. In fact, it was a no-brainer because so many of them had contracted chlamydia, and all of them showed clear signs of anal and genital trauma consistent with violent penetration. And even before I exposed all this, the parents were talking to myself about the children exhibiting radical changes in behavior, including temper outbursts, sudden mood shifts, the poor impulse control. Understand that the reason the parents would talk to me about this was because they were bringing their children to the library to be left in the children's room because they didn't trust the daycare center anymore. And
I'm surprised they trusted you to keep the kids.
you know, it wasn't me so much as what we called the Carnegie ladies. The Carnegie ladies were these old biddies who refused to retire. And these were the old librarians who were so Parkinsonian in their symptoms. They were so tremulous. They couldn't even conduct data entry. In other words, they couldn't even fucking type. So we would just have them sit in the children's room and read books to the children, books they could barely hold. So they'd have to lay the books on the table and have the children flip the pages. It kept everybody involved and everybody kind of busy. So I wasn't just taking care of kids, I was taking care of seniors. There you go. My early experience with care provision. And I was sitting everybody.
That's cool, though.
I guess. And well, better than
I got you embarrassed now. I'm sorry. I didn't
no
mean
worries.
to do that.
Yeah, no worries. Better than the alternative. And so basically, both Michael Aquino and his Satanist wife Lilith were positively identified by all the victims as 2 of the perpetrators, and they identified their home. They described with uncanny accuracy the distinctively satanic interior of the house.
Well, a solid black interior is kind of distinctive, yeah.
Yes. And so there we have that. As for the other members of the military, only one other member of the military was ever charged for the abuse of a single child, and those charges were dismissed 3 months later. And by the next year, 1987, in fact, it was August 14th, as part of the Presidio investigation, that a search warrant was served on the residence of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino and his wife Lilith, and they confiscated numerous pornographic videotapes, photographs of child pornography, photo albums full of abused children, photographic negatives, the cassette tapes, the address books. They were all confiscated. And the soundproof room was attested to by all of the officers involved. And yet nothing, of course, ever came of it. By 1987, it was the same year, around November, the U.S. Army, of course, was then exposed by myself. At that point, I was able to get the investigations extended to 15 of its other daycare centers. And then elementary schools became involved, like what happened at McMartin. There were at least 2 other cases at Air Force daycare centers. Military elementary schools, of course, were involved. There was another center run by the U.S. Navy. In addition to all of those, a special team of experts was sent to Panama to determine if as many as 100 children at a Department of Defense elementary school were molested, because they all came out infected with AIDS. And another case, emerged at the U.S.-run facility in West Germany. These cases occurred, as I said, at the most esteemed military bases throughout the United States: Fort Dix, Fort Leavenworth, Fort Jackson, West Point. And in the West Point case alone, by the end of the year 1987, hundreds of children were interviewed by investigators, all of them reporting satanic acts, animal sacrifices, forced to adopt and take care of little kittens and puppies, and then forced to kill them, cult-like behavior among the abusers. And that's when Rudolph Giuliani said, "There's no federal grand jury indictment to be had." He said the parents are doing this to their own kids so they can sue the government for big bucks. And the kids are doing it to themselves because they're hungry for attention. Yeah, and he did, by the way, conclude that, well, 1 or 2 of the children were abused, but that's it. But nothing was ever done. And by 1988, the year after that, and again, a full year, it was around November 4th, that's when the FBI raided the Franklin Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska, run by a Black African-American Republican named Lawrence King. And in the process, that's when they uncovered the evidence related to drug running, pedophilia, pornography, satanic activity involving prominent individuals in the local community and beyond. 80 children came forward immediately. They identified all of those involved, including the chief of police, who had impregnated one of the victims, who was actually obviously a girl, and a local newspaper publisher, a former vice squad officer, a judge. Those are the only ones I remember, but there were many, many more.
There were lots of people, and out of all of the people involved, 2 of the witnesses did jail time.
Thank you.
That's it.
Yeah.
Just 2 of the witnesses, and they were sent up for perjury.
Yes. And the evidence that came out all showed that the children were abducted from shopping mall parking lots, auctioned off in Las Vegas and Toronto. The airplanes owned by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, were used to transport the children. Talk about Federal Express. And other children were removed from orphanages and foster homes, taken to Washington, D.C. to take part in sex orgies with dignitaries, congressmen, high-ranking public officials. A number of the child victims testified that George Bush Sr. was one of the people who was seen at all these parties. And photographs were being surreptitiously taken at those orgies by child traffickers for blackmail purposes. And there was evidence of ties to mind control programs being conducted at Offutt Air Force Base, OFFUTT, OFFUTT, Offutt Air Force Base near Omaha, Nebraska, where the head of the Strategic Air Command is located. This was all the legacy of General Curtis LeMay. And Minot, Minot, that's an area that has satanic cults operated in it that were directly tied to the Son of Sam and Manson murders, among others. There was no follow-up investigation when these findings were made. The U.S. national media never even reported the story. And all the while that this was happening, there was everything, of course, going on with my personal involvement with Michael Aquino. There were, back in 1983, he was taking off from the Presidio and was involved in West Point. And that's when the Virginian County Police were asked to make an inquiry into the leaders of Temple of Set. And they came up finding that, of course, the Virginian inquiry, they found 12 other leading lights of the Temple of Set organization, all of them members of U.S. Army intelligence. They were all involved in what was going down at West Point. So we're talking about a true conspiracy here. And in fact, the Republican Senator, John DeCamp, a former CIA agent himself, he was on the investigative committee. He wrote a book exposing the case entitled The Franklin Cover-Up. So that's when Paul Bonacci, who was kept as a child sex slave by Lawrence King, come 1999, positively identified Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino as an associate of Larry King, who he said was known to the children only as the Colonel. Now, Rusty Nelson, King's personal photographer, identified Aquino as the man that he once saw King give a briefcase full of money to and bearer bonds, money and bearer bonds, and whom Larry King told him was involved in the Contra gun and cocaine trafficking operation being run by George Bush Sr. and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Now, by May of 1989, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino was questioned, finally, in connection with child abuse investigations. And that time, at least 5 children in 3 cities were making those accusations. Those children had seen Aquino in the newspaper and television coverage of the Presidio case I exposed and immediately recognized him as one of their abusers. The children were from Ukiah, Santa Rosa, and Fort Bragg, all California. And by 1990, well, it was August 31st, that Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino was processed out of the Army after being investigated for satanic ritual abuse, never formally charged, but according to all court documents, Aquino was titled, that means named, in the report of investigation by the Army's Criminal Investigative Division for indecent acts with a child, sodomy, conspiracy, kidnapping, and false swearing. And all the child abuse charges remained against Aquino because, according to the CID itself, the evidence of alibi offered by Aquino was not persuasive. So Aquino, of course, laterally transferred into Black Ops off the books. And that's how he was able to claim while he was alive that he became one of the first space intelligence officers during that same year, that he was stationed at Cheyenne Mountain for 4 years of active duty before retiring. Of course, if you ask the U.S. Army that, they'll say that's a lie, that there's no evidence that's true. But I tend to believe Aquino on that because, well, take a look at the rest of the history and how nothing was done to him and that he was actually rewarded for all of his crimes. And understand that his personal connection with me it's almost beyond description. You're talking about an individual. The reason I know he was obsessed with me from the very beginning was because of how far out of his way he went to conduct a binding spell involving myself. It was way back on my birthday eve day October 19th through the morning of October 20th, my birthday eve day into the morning, on to the point of high noon. The very moment I was born was high noon on the 20th of October in Taiwan. And from midnight of the night before or noon of the day before to high noon of the next day, Michael Aquino went to Wewelsburg Castle in Germany. Wewelsburg, of course,
I know that site, yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Just so our listeners know, that's the Teutoburg forest where Arminius's German warriors slaughtered 3 Roman legions in the 9th year of the Christian calendar. So it's about in the mountains, 20 miles from Paderborn.
Where the missing legions are.
Thank you. Thank you. And so
we are getting close to the end, so you must.
Yeah, I'll wrap up.
At the top of the hour, there's another show.
Understood her. Yeah. So it was 1982 that Aquino conducted that ritual. Understand that I didn't start working at the Presidio military base library until that year. It was the very year that I started working there that Aquino conducted that ritual in Germany on my birthday. So this was when he immediately thereafter requested that I become his liaison. Now is the pattern, I hope, become more visible in terms of his obsession with me at a young age. So hopefully that puts that in some perspective. And of course, I want to thank everybody for their patience with this god-awful subject. And we hope as well that understand this. The question isn't whether Michael Aquino is guilty of being one of the world's most despicable pedophiles and mind control programmers ever to crawl out of a toilet, which I think all evidence makes quite clear. Rather, the question is whether there is a conspiracy against him by all these people, including young children, making these allegations against him over the years. For what reason? After all, that's exactly what he always claimed to be the case. And that's exactly how he attempted to excuse those many claims against him. I mean, conspiracy or not, it's certainly quite unusual for his name to come up in so many cases of child abuse and sex slavery. You can count on your own suffrage, if you were to investigate, at least 200 open public child victims who were part of all of the aforecited events, who would have had to be quite carefully coached to lie without being tripped up by a more intelligent adult during questioning. And then there were all the doctors who were involved in examining those children who testified that all of them had definite physical signs of having been sexually violated. They would also have to be in on that conspiracy. And there would also have to be the children's parents, who would have had to have been either very easily deceived by their own children or were in on the conspiracy as well. And of course, there were also all the investigators and attorneys and judges who supposedly conspired against Aquino in the Presidio case. Now, Occam's razor dictates that the simplest explanation that requires the least assumptions to be made is usually the most accurate one. And so Aquino's explanation that he was the victim of a conspiracy lacks any plausibility whatsoever when compared to the alternative explanation that all those people were speaking honestly and were supported by a very large amount of evidence that explained and exposed the inner machinations of the criminal syndicate that Aquino had been deeply involved in throughout his military career. Now, this criminal syndicate has been central to all the mind control programs and all the psychological operations that have been playing out on the American public since at least 1947, when the CIA was first established. And of course, that is something that brings us to the fact that this is a war of remembrance. Understand this much. While I've pointed out that all the memories of these victims are true, there is a false memory syndrome. It's a mass delusion that America won the Second World War. That's the propaganda foisted upon the tax-paying electorate by this same military, occult, intelligence, industrial complex that runs all this child trafficking. and these people tell you they won the Second World War, the only thing they're good at is raping babies, people. Understand that. That's why it's important. Here, I bring out a plug for the Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II, co-authored by Peter Moon in Writing with Myself, because that can help cure you of your false memory syndrome in that regard. And it's far more important that you cure that as a foundation for your ever dealing with this. The reality is what these kids are all saying is true, but what the military is telling you is false. So Michael Aquino was one of the men called back from Vietnam to start that deception. So understand it's nonfiction, and do make a purchase. The Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II is available on Amazon, and you can find it through www.skybooksusa.com to order it directly from the publisher. Either way, be on the lookout for it. See if you can buy it in the store. In particular, it always helps. Just purchase it, period, no matter how. I owe Penny, of course, her autographed copy. I haven't sent my autographed copy to anyone who's asked for it yet, but I will try.
I want it. I want it. I want it.
Okay. Well, you'll have to send me an address.
I'll send it to you. I'll send the address on a T-shirt that says DDD 3D Douglas Dwayne Dietrich.
All right. Douglas, thank you so much for coming today.
Love you, Penny. Love Blue too. There we are. He knocked back. That was like ghost rapping,
no,
right?
That was someone at the door.
Oh, hold on.
Well,
since people are talking, y'all got the door. I got something for you. Now, Doug, I got a question. Before the state of Israel was made, and you know, as we say, before it was made, the Zionist agenda was sitting there. Why is there nothing in written documentation about Israel until they created the state of Israel? And why did they have to carve it out of Palestine? There are some things I got questions, and I know you got answers to.
Sure.
It's like, why did we get attacked back in the 1960s? Our naval ship got attacked, and they covered it up. Listen, people, this is why you need Douglas Dietrich in your head. This is why you need him in your heart. And this is why you need him on radio. Because the truth is going to set you free. And yes, I know, Penny. Reverend Ed is coming up next. I love you, Penny. I don't even have to look. I can read your mind. I've known you too long, Penny. Daggone it, you're almost like a sister to me. And I want to say, I love the host on Global Enlightenment. But let's go back to this question. Why is there no mention of Israel anywhere in the world?
Well, there is. It's just that people haven't been looking in the right place. I mean, it's out there, but it's, shall we say, a lot of it was covered up because, of course, it doesn't reflect well upon the conspiracy to establish the state of Israel. And there was a conspiracy behind it, of course.
Ooh, that's another topic. Hold on. That's a teaser.
Yes.
Oh. Douglas Dietrich just said there's a conspiracy behind it. Ladies, when Douglas come back the next show, we're going to make sure he gets into this because I got the shakes. Because Odin is here and I love to drink my beer. But Douglas Dietrich, whew, you cannot smear his name in front of me or around this network. Douglas Dietrich is gold. He's a god. He has been here for many years. And I want people to understand. You're listening to Global. You listen to Douglas, you're going to be listening soon to the Penny Bradley Global Conspiracy Radio Network. And I'm begging you people to understand Douglas Dietrich will always be the man. I don't care what you think. If you try to talk against him here, I'm coming after you. Thank you very much. I love Douglas, man. My mom loves him. If my mom loves you, I love you. Oh, Jeffrey Daugherty, me, you got to talk after this, wants you on his show. He listen, he's like, it's been years. I want him. Listen for Douglas Dietrich on Jeffrey Daugherty's Unindoctrinated on Late Night in the Heartland. which is on this Global Light Radio Network as well.
Great.
I want people to understand, Douglas is back with a vengeance. And I want them to understand that this man is 100% real. He speaks the truth, and I don't give a goddamn what you feel about Douglas. You better understand, he's going to expose you next. Government, 3-letter agencies, people involved, instruments that you use, and the hidden secrets you got. I don't care where you're at, Bohemian Grove or anywhere else, Douglas is coming after you. 2021 is looking really good, doesn't it, for these counterfeits?
Yes.
Douglas, I love you, man.
You're beautiful, Daryl. I love your mother too.
Oh my God.
Doris. Yes.
Yeah, see how you say it?
Doris. For me, Daryl.
Yes.
Oh my God. You know something? hey,
And
in the
say
show,
hi
Penny.
to
In the
Maida
show, Penny. I'm
because,
about to
yes,
cry.
we saw her bringing you your dinner.
There we are.
See, you know, we're family. And that's the way we
Yes.
do it on this network. Now, Penny, close us out because I got to go get Reverend Ed. You know how he is because he's on a hot streak tonight.
Well, good night, guys. Thank everyone who listened, and thank you much, Daryl, for making this possible, and Douglas for joining us.
We love Douglas. We love Penny. Everybody, y'all better cheer these two people on because they're the only ones fighting for you. Douglas, end us off, bro. Forget Penny. End us off.
Oh, blessings to all of you and all who support us. I love you all dearly. And join me tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/C/Douglas Dietrich. Yes.
Good night, everybody. Happy Halloween. I hope this didn't scare you. Good night.